Every empire has a throne room where the man in power believes he is untouchable. Duke Cadric Mordain sat in his tonight while storm clouds devoured Blackthorne Keep, and his wife bled alone 2 corridors away. He held another woman's hand. He listened to music. He drank wine aged longer than his marriage. And somewhere between the second glass and the third, his entire dynasty began to collapse. Not because enemies breached the gates, but because the woman he abandoned decided she was done being silent. Stay until the end of this story. You will never see a duchess the same way again. The eastern birthing chamber smelled like iron and tallow. Candlelight threw violent shadows across stone walls older than the empire itself, while wind screamed through gaps in the lead-paned windows like something alive trying to get inside. Rain hammered the battlements in sheets so dense the torches along the outer walls had drowned hours ago. The entire eastern wing of Blackthorne Keep existed now in a pocket of yellow firelight surrounded by absolute darkness. Serafina Valicrest gripped the bed frame with both hands and felt a contraction rip through her body with enough force to bend her spine backward against the soaked pillows. Blood had already saturated the linen beneath her. The midwife's hands moved quickly between her thighs while 2 attending physicians argued in whispers near the door about whether the hemorrhaging could be stopped without surgical intervention. No one argued loudly. The Duchess of Blackthorne did not tolerate panic, not from servants, not from physicians, not from the terrified handmaidens clustered near the fireplace, wringing their hands and watching their mistress labor through what everyone privately acknowledged might kill her. "Breathe, Your Grace." The midwife's voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. "The child is positioned wrong. I need you to wait for the next wave before—" "I know what a breech birth feels like," Serafina's voice came through clenched teeth. Sweat plastered dark hair against her temples and throat. "This is not my first." It was her third. The first 2 never survived long enough to open their eyes. Martha, the senior handmaiden who had served Serafina since before the marriage, pressed a cold cloth against the Duchess's forehead. Her weathered face betrayed nothing, but her hands shook as she smoothed matted hair away from Serafina's jawline. "Should I send for the Duke, Your Grace?" The question landed like a blade dropped on marble. Every woman in that chamber knew where the Duke was. Every woman had walked past the grand music hall on the way to the birthing wing. Every woman had seen the candlelight spilling beneath the doors and heard the soft plucking of strings and the quieter sound of a woman's laughter mixing with it like honey stirred into something already too sweet. Serafina stared in the ceiling, a fresh contraction built inside her abdomen like a fist tightening around her pelvis. She breathed through it the way she breathed through everything, by refusing to let anyone see the cost. "No." One word. Martha nodded and said nothing else, because Serafina Valicrest had learned years ago that asking a man to be present was just another way of admitting you still expected something from him. An expectation was the last luxury she could afford. 2 corridors west and 1 floor below, Duke Cadric Mordain sat in a velvet chair positioned precisely 6 feet from the grand fireplace in Blackthorne's music hall. The chair had been placed there deliberately. Everything in Cadric's world existed by deliberate placement: people, furniture, loyalty, fear. He arranged the elements of his empire the way a surgeon arranged instruments, each piece functional, each positioned for maximum effect, none permitted to exist without serving his purpose. Tonight the fireplace served as theater. Flames ate through birch logs imported from the northern provinces, casting copper light across a room designed to intimidate visiting diplomats and reward compliant allies. Tapestries depicting Mordain military victories hung from ceiling to floor. Silver candelabras lined the marble mantel. The musicians, a string quartet brought from the capital specifically for the Duchess's confinement celebrations, played something achingly gentle that floated through the hall like perfume over a wound. Celestine Vero sat beside him on a chaise upholstered in midnight blue. She was 23. Serafina was 31. The arithmetic of that comparison had already destroyed several noble reputations across the empire, and Celestine understood every digit of it. She wore emerald silk tonight, cut low enough to suggest availability without crossing into vulgarity. Her dark hair fell in loose waves past bare shoulders. Her eyes, the precise amber of autumn light filtered through whiskey, studied Cadric's profile with the patient intensity of someone who had learned that powerful men were best approached the way one approached territorial predators, slowly, from the side, never from the front. "The physicians say the labor is difficult," she offered quietly. Cadric lifted his wine glass without looking at her. "The physicians say what they believe will motivate me to act the way they expect." "And what do you expect?" "I expect my heir to be born alive." He drank. "Beyond that, I have no use for expectation." Celestine studied him. Most women would have recoiled from that answer. The casual cruelty of it. The surgical dismissal of the woman currently hemorrhaging in his own castle while he sat drinking imported wine. But Celestine Vero was not most women. She was the daughter of General Marcus Vero, whose military career ended in public disgrace when imperial auditors discovered he had been selling garrison supplies to border insurgents for 6 years. The Vero name became synonymous with treason overnight. Celestine watched her family estate burn, watched her mother drink herself into institutional care, watched her father eat a pistol in his study 3 weeks after the verdict. She was 14. By 16, she understood that survival was not given to people who waited for the world to be fair. It was taken by people willing to become whatever the situation required. Tonight, the situation required emerald silk and gentle touches against the knuckles of a man whose wife bled in the East Wing. "You should be with her," Celestine whispered. Not because she meant it, because saying it positioned her as compassionate, as selfless, as the woman who loved him enough to send him back to his wife. The performance was flawless. Cadric recognized it instantly. That was the architecture of their understanding. He knew she was performing. She knew he knew. Neither acknowledged it, because the transaction between them was never about honesty. It was about function. Celestine provided something Serafina could not: the comfort of being admired without being known, the relief of standing beside someone who saw only the surface of him and found it magnificent. Serafina had always seen deeper, and what she saw there had long ago stopped impressing her. "She chose tonight to deliver," Cadric said flatly. "I have the Castellan trade delegation arriving at dawn. I have 3 military governors expecting revised territorial agreements by week's end. I have half the royal court watching whether this heir survives long enough to be christened." He set down the glass. "I do not have time to sit beside a bed and watch what I cannot control." It sounded like strategy. It was terror. Cadric Mordain had buried 2 children already. 2 infants wrapped in white linen and placed inside marble tombs while court musicians played the same melodies they played tonight. He remembered the weight of the first, barely heavier than a loaf of bread. He remembered the silence of the second, born without crying, without movement, without anything resembling the life he had been promised. He did not discuss this, not with Celestine, not with his advisors, not with the physicians who suggested counseling, or the court chaplains who attempted comfort. Cadric Mordain processed grief the same way he processed political opposition. He buried it so deep it became architecture. Load-bearing walls inside his chest that held up everything else. Remove one, and the entire structure would collapse. So he sat in the music hall. He held his mistress's hand, and he pretended his wife's screams were just the storm. The marriage between Cadric Mordain and Serafina Valacrest had been engineered before either of them understood the cost. House Mordain held military supremacy across the Northern Empire, iron mines, weapons foundries, 3 standing armies, and a reputation for brutality that kept border provinces compliant through the simple promise of annihilation. House Valacrest held something Cadric's father never managed to acquire despite 30 years of conquest: legitimacy. The Valacrest bloodline connected directly to the founding royal dynasty. Their name appeared on treaties, constitutions, and succession documents stretching back 7 generations. They controlled the empire's financial infrastructure with the quiet competence of people who understood that money moved slower than armies but lasted longer. The marriage united steel and gold. Cadric was 24. Serafina was 22. Neither chose the other. Both understood the transaction. The wedding ceremony drew 16,000 spectators. Fireworks painted the capital skyline in Mordain crimson and Valacrest silver. Newspapers declared it the beginning of a golden age. For approximately 9 months, they believed their own performance. Serafina discovered early that her husband operated entirely through control. Not the crude control of tyrants who screamed orders and punished disobedience. Something more precise, Kedrick controlled environments. He controlled information. He controlled the emotional temperature of every room he entered by calibrating exactly how much warmth to withhold. Intimacy became rationed. Affection became strategic. And vulnerability, the one currency Serafina offered freely during their first year, became a weapon he studied rather than received. She stopped offering it by the second year. "You treat love like a siege campaign," she told him once during an argument that historians would never record. "You position yourself. You calculate response times. You withdraw resources when compliance isn't immediate." Kedrick had stared at her with an expression she later recognized as genuine confusion. What else would I do with it? That question lived inside her like a splinter that never worked its way out. The first pregnancy changed the mathematics of their silence. Suddenly, their private dysfunction carried public consequences. The empire needed an heir. Military alliances depended on succession security. Trade agreements contained clauses triggered by legitimate birth. Their child became a geopolitical instrument before it had a heartbeat. The miscarriage happened at 5 months. Serafina survived it alone in their private chambers, while Kedrick managed the political fallout from the capital. He sent physicians. He sent flowers. He sent a handwritten letter expressing condolences so perfectly crafted it read like diplomatic correspondence. She burned the letter. The second pregnancy progressed further. 7 months. Long enough for the court to begin preparations. Long enough for nurseries to be furnished and succession announcements drafted. The child lived 6 days. 6 days of breathing that sounded like paper rustling against glass. 6 days of midnight feedings and desperate prayers that dissolved into the stone ceiling of Blackthorne Keep without answer. 6 days during which Serafina held a living creature against her chest and felt its warmth and smelled its impossible newness and allowed herself, against every survival instinct she possessed, to believe something beautiful might survive inside her marriage. On the 7th morning, she woke to silence, the kind of silence that enters a room like a physical weight, the kind that never fully leaves. Kedrick stood beside the empty cradle for 11 minutes. Serafina knew because she counted every second, watching his face for something, anything, that resembled the devastation consuming her from the inside out. His jaw tightened once. Then he turned and walked to his study and spent the next 14 hours restructuring military contracts. That was the night Serafina understood her husband was not cold. He was demolished, and he would burn down everything around him before he admitted it. Celestine arrived at Blackthorne 18 months later, presented as the companion of Ambassador Vero during trade negotiations. Nobody with political intelligence believed the cover story. General Vero's disgraced daughter appearing at the most powerful court in the empire carried exactly one plausible explanation. Kedrick took her to his bed within 6 weeks. The affair was not passionate. That would have been almost forgivable. Instead, it was architectural. Celestine served as insulation between Kedrick and the emotional destruction he refused to process. She required nothing from him except proximity to power. He required nothing from her except the absence of history. She had not buried his children. She had not watched his jaw tighten over an empty cradle. She had not witnessed the 11 minutes. With Celestine, he could be the version of himself that still functioned. The conqueror, the strategist, the man the empire feared, not the man whose hands had trembled when he touched a dead infant's face. Serafina knew about the affair within 3 days. Her intelligence network, a web of merchant contacts, servant loyalties, and financial informants that rivaled anything the Imperial Spy Service operated, delivered confirmation before the court gossips had finished their first round of whispers. She did not confront Kedrick, not because she lacked the strength, because confrontation required believing the relationship still contained something worth fighting for. Instead, she redirected. Every ounce of strategic intelligence that had once been spent maintaining her marriage now flowed into the financial infrastructure beneath the empire. She restructured trade agreements, renegotiated shipping contracts, built parallel supply chains that circumvented Mordain military logistics entirely. She embedded her own loyalists into banking institutions, merchant guilds, and provincial tax offices with the patient precision of someone planting a garden she intended to harvest years later. Kedrick never noticed. Men who believe they rule through force rarely monitor the quieter forms of power flowing beneath their foundations. Now the third pregnancy had arrived like a verdict neither of them requested. and the storm outside Blackthorne Keep screamed loud enough to cover the sounds from the birthing chamber. The child came just before the 4th hour past midnight. Serafina felt the final contraction hit, with enough violence to tear a sound from her that she would never forgive herself for making. Not a scream. Something lower. More animal. The sound of a body surrendering control to a process older and more brutal than anything political power could replicate. The midwife worked fast. Blood poured across the birthing table in quantities that made one of the younger handmaidens faint against the stone wall. The physicians moved in with surgical instruments prepared for emergency intervention. Then a cry split the air, thin, furious, alive. Martha caught the infant and pressed him against clean linen while the midwife cut the cord with practiced efficiency. The child screamed with a raw persistence that filled the chamber like sunlight flooding a prison cell. A son. Martha carried him to Serafina and placed him against the Duchess's chest. Serafina looked down at the wrinkled, furious, blood-streaked creature fighting against her collarbone. His fists clenched at nothing. His mouth opened and closed in outrage at the cold, the light, the indignity of being born into a world that had already failed him twice through previous bodies. She pressed her lips against his scalp. He was warm. Warm in a way that reached past every defense she had constructed over 8 years of marriage, past every calcification, past every deliberately installed numbness, and touched something underneath that she had stopped acknowledging existed. Her vision blurred, not from exhaustion, not from blood loss, from the specific cruelty of loving something she was already afraid to lose. "Your Grace," Martha's voice was careful. "The Duke should be informed." Serafina blinked once, her expression reset with a precision that would have impressed any diplomat in the Empire. "Send Dr. Hartworth, not a servant." Martha understood the calculus instantly. A physician delivering the news was medical protocol. A servant would imply the Duchess was requesting her husband's presence. The distinction mattered. In the architecture of aristocratic dignity, the woman who summoned a straying husband lost more than the husband who strayed. Serafina would not lose one more thing tonight. In the music hall, the fire had burned low when Dr. Hartworth entered through the service corridor. His surgical coat still carried bloodstains visible even in the diminished candlelight. The string quartet had stopped playing an hour ago. Only Celestine remained, sitting near the fireplace with a book open on her lap that she had not actually read. Cadric stood near the windows, watching lightning illuminate the mountain ridgeline. "Your Grace." Hartworth's voice carried the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 4 hours preventing a woman from dying. "You have a son. The child is healthy, strong lungs. Good weight despite the early arrival." He paused. "The Duchess lost considerable blood. She will require weeks of recovery, but she will survive." The physician delivered that final sentence with a weight that was not entirely medical. Kedric's reflection stared back at him from the dark window glass. Lightning flashed behind his image like something detonating inside his silhouette. A son. Alive. Breathing. The word alive moved through him like a seismic tremor through bedrock. Something deep and structural shifted inside his chest. Something he had cemented shut after the second infant funeral. Something that threatened, for one uncontrolled moment, to crack open wide enough to swallow him entirely. His hands curled against the window frame. Celestine watched from across the room. She saw the tremor in his shoulders, saw the white-knuckle pressure against the stone. She had spent 18 months studying this man's body for signals of vulnerability, and she recognized this one instantly. He was afraid. Not of the child, of what the child would cost him. Because Caedric Mordain understood something that Celestine never would. The previous 2 children had not merely died. They had detonated inside his psyche like charges placed against the foundation of a building already compromised by structural damage. Each death removed another supporting wall. Each funeral cemented another doorway shut. A living child meant an unsealed doorway. And unsealed doorways let in everything he had spent years keeping out. Dawn brought gray light through the lead-paned windows of the private chamber where Serafina sat beside the cradle. The storm had passed, leaving the mountains cloaked in mist so thick the world beyond Blackthorne Keep appeared to have been erased entirely, replaced by white nothing. The infant slept with his fists curled against his cheeks. His breathing came in soft bursts that Serafina counted without realizing she was doing it, an unconscious habit from the second child, from the 6 days. Counting breaths meant he was still alive. She had not slept. Martha had changed the bedding, removed the surgical instruments, cleaned the blood from the stone floor. The chamber now looked almost civilized, almost peaceful, the kind of room an empire would paint portraits of when historians recorded the birth of the heir. But Serafina sat in the chair beside the cradle wearing a silk robe over surgical bandages, and her eyes held the specific stillness of a woman who had made a decision she could not unmake. The door opened. Cadric entered. He had changed into formal morning attire, dark coat, white cravat, polished boots. His appearance was immaculate, every element of his presentation calibrated to project authority and normalcy. But his eyes betrayed him. Red-rimmed, slightly swollen, the particular damage left by a night spent staring at darkness instead of sleeping. He stopped 3 feet from the cradle. The physician says he is strong. He is. And you? Alive. Serafina's voice carried no warmth and no bitterness, flat as a diplomatic dispatch, which I understand was uncertain for several hours. I was informed of the complications. You were informed. The sentence hung between them. Cadric's jaw tightened. The same micro-movement she had catalogued 100 times. The same muscular compression that preceded either violence or retreat. In political negotiations, it meant someone was about to lose territory. In their marriage, it meant someone was about to lose something that could not be recovered. What do you want me to say, Serafina? Nothing. She adjusted the blanket around the infant without looking up. I stopped expecting you to say the right thing approximately 4 years ago. What I require now is information. Information? Were you with her the entire time? Silence. The kind of silence that functions as testimony. I was managing the political situation, the Castellan delegation. Were you with her the entire time? Not a question now. A demand stripped of its inflection. A blade with no handle. Cadric exhaled slowly. She was present in the room, yes. Serafina finally looked at him, and the expression on her face was nothing he had prepared for. Not rage, not grief, not the theatrical devastation that noble women performed in court dramas and romantic literature. Something beyond those categories entirely. Recognition. The look of a woman seeing clearly something she had spent years examining through distorted glass. Every excuse removed, every diplomatic fiction dissolved, every careful architecture of denial and arrangement and political pragmatism stripped down to bare foundation. She saw him, and what she saw was a man who had chosen comfort over duty, performance over presence, and a woman who admired his surface over a woman who had survived his depths. I want you to understand something, she said quietly. Not as your wife, not as the mother of your heir, as the woman who controls 43% of the financial infrastructure supporting this duchy. Cadric's expression shifted. You will not threaten me with... I am not threatening you, Cadric. She rose from the chair. In the thin morning light, bandaged and bloodless and exhausted, she looked nothing like the fragile wife the Empire imagined. She looked like the thing Cadric had never allowed himself to see, a power structure he had failed to account for. I am informing you, she continued, that as of 3 hours ago, every merchant fleet operating under Valicrest Trade Authority has suspended cooperative agreements with Mordain Military Logistics. Every financial guarantor attached to your northern expansion campaign has received notice of independent audit review, and every noble house currently bound to Blackthorne through economic treaty has been contacted by my representatives offering alternative arrangements. The room temperature dropped. Cadric stared at her. You would dismantle your own household. You dismantled it first. She stepped closer. Close enough that he could see the surgical bruising beneath her jaw where she had bitten through her own lip during labor. You just did it quietly enough that you convinced yourself it was still standing. The infant stirred in the cradle. A small sound. The kind of sound that in a different marriage might have united 2 parents in shared wonder. Instead, it divided the room into territories. Serafina on one side holding the heir and the financial infrastructure. Kedrick on the other, holding military power and the sudden nauseating realization that military power without financial support was just organized violence waiting to collapse. "You have until the Castellan delegation arrives at dawn tomorrow," Serafina said. "That gives you approximately 22 hours to decide whether the Duke of Blackthorne rules an empire or a ruin." She turned back toward the cradle. "Close the door when you leave." Kedrick stood motionless for 7 seconds. Then he turned and walked into the corridor, and the sound of his boots against the marble echoed through Blackthorne Keep, like the first cracks forming in a structure everyone assumed was permanent. In the nursery, Serafina lifted her son against her chest and felt his heartbeat synchronize with the pulse hammering through her damaged body. She had drawn the first line. What she had not yet calculated, what no intelligence network or financial model could predict, was the identity of the person already watching from inside the castle walls. Someone who had waited years for exactly this fracture between Duke and Duchess. Someone whose loyalty both Caedric and Serafina believed they owned. Someone who intended to make certain neither of them survived the week. The sealed letter arrived on Castellan Renard Voss's desk before the ink on Serafina's financial withdrawal orders had dried. Not delivered by messenger. Not carried through official channels. Simply placed on polished mahogany sometime between the changing of the night guard and the first gray suggestion of dawn leaking through Blackthorne Keep's arrow-slit windows. No seal, no signature, just 12 lines of precise handwriting on paper so expensive it could only have originated from inside the castle itself. Renard read it twice. Then he burned it in the candle flame beside his writing instruments and watched the ash curl against the bronze tray until nothing remained except the faint chemical smell of destroyed evidence. He had served House Mordain for 23 years. Senior Castellan, keeper of household accounts, diplomatic correspondence, and the particular variety of secrets that powerful families generated the way furnaces generated heat, constantly, involuntarily, and in quantities that could kill if improperly managed. The Empire believed Renard Voss was furniture, reliable, silent, decorative in the way that competent servants became decorative after enough years of invisible service. Caedric trusted him the way men trusted foundations, absolutely, and without ever looking down to check for cracks. Serafina trusted him less, but even her intelligence network had never flagged the Castellan as anything other than what he appeared. Loyal, efficient, forgettable. That was the entire point. Renard straightened his coat, adjusted the household keys hanging from his belt, and walked toward the east wing with the measured pace of a man who had spent 2 decades perfecting the appearance of someone with nothing to hide. The corridor connecting the Castellan's quarters to the main household offices passed directly beneath the nursery. Renard paused at the junction where servant passages intersected with the formal hallways. Above him, through 12 inches of stone and timber, a newborn infant breathed in the particular rhythm of deep sleep. He listened for 4 seconds, then continued walking. Caedric had not slept. He stood in his private study surrounded by maps, military dispatches, and the wreckage of a financial architecture he had assumed was permanent. His coat hung over the desk chair. His cravat lay discarded on the floor like a shed skin. The formal composure he had maintained during the conversation with Serafina had dissolved somewhere around the 3rd hour of reviewing the documents his Treasury advisors delivered in panicked sequence throughout the night. The numbers were catastrophic. Not immediately. The duchy would not collapse tomorrow or next week. But the trajectory was unmistakable. Serafina had not merely withdrawn financial support. She had restructured the underlying agreements in ways that made restoration nearly impossible without her direct cooperation. Trade routes that once flowed automatically through Mordain-controlled channels now required Valicrest authorization at 17 different junctures. Military supply contracts that Caedric assumed were secured through loyalty were actually secured through financial guarantees that Serafina's family had quietly underwritten for years. He had been standing on her floor the entire time, and he never looked down. "You're going to wear a hole in that map if you keep staring at it." Caedric turned. Lord Aldrich Hale stood in the doorway with 2 glasses of brandy and the expression of a man who had delivered bad news to dangerous people enough times to know exactly how close to stand. Aldrich was Caedric's chief military advisor, 46 years old. scarred across the left side of his jaw from a border skirmish that killed 37 men under his command. He walked with a slight limp from a riding accident he never discussed, and drank brandy at hours that would concern physicians in less violent professions. He was also the closest thing Caedric Mordain had to a friend, which meant he was permitted to enter rooms without knocking approximately 4 times per year. "How bad?" Aldrich asked, handing Caedric a glass. "Define bad." "Treasury collapse bad. Revolution bad. Flee the country bad." "Somewhere between the first and second." Caedric took the brandy but did not drink. "She moved faster than I calculated possible. Half these restructuring orders were filed weeks ago. She was building this before the labor started." "Before or during the affair?" The question hit like a slap. Caedric's eyes cut toward Aldrich with enough heat to melt diplomatic language entirely. "Choose your next sentence carefully. I've been choosing sentences carefully around you for 15 years. It's exhausting, and it doesn't work." Aldrich settled into the chair across the desk with the deliberate comfort of someone who understood that physical ease was itself a form of defiance in Caedric's presence. "Your wife just gutted your financial infrastructure while recovering from nearly bleeding to death. You're standing here staring at maps instead of dealing with the actual problem, and Celestine Vero is still sleeping in a guest chamber 60 feet from your nursery." "Celestine is not the problem. Celestine is the detonator. Serafina is the explosive. You are the idiot who lit the fuse and then acted surprised when the building caught fire." Caedric set down the brandy glass hard enough to crack the base. "Careful." "Or what? You'll dismiss me? Exile me? I'm the only person in this castle willing to tell you the truth. And right now the truth is that you have approximately 18 hours before the Castellan trade delegation walks through those gates expecting to negotiate with the most powerful duke in the empire. What they're going to find instead is a man whose wife just demonstrated that she can dismantle his entire operation from a birthing bed." Silence filled the study like cold water rising. Caedric stared at the map spread across his desk. Territory markings in red ink, military positions in black, trade routes in blue. The entire visual architecture of his power rendered in colored lines across parchment. None of those lines meant anything without money behind them. "What do you suggest?" The words cost him something. Aldrich could see the price in the rigid set of Caedric's shoulders, the slight forward lean that meant his body was fighting the instinct to reject external input entirely. "Talk to your wife." "I tried." "No, you stood in her room and waited for her to behave like a subordinate receiving a performance review. That is not talking. That is managing, and she is done being managed." Caedric's fingers pressed against the desk surface until the tendons in his forearms stood out like cables. "She will not negotiate. I know that expression. I've seen it across negotiating tables with men who burned their own cities before surrendering them." "Then don't negotiate. Surrender." The word landed like a grenade in a cathedral. "Surrender what?" "Celestine. Immediately. Publicly. Not a quiet reassignment. Not a diplomatic relocation. A visible, unambiguous termination of the arrangement. Before the delegation arrives. Before the court hears the financial details. Before your enemies have time to calculate exactly how exposed you are." Caedric's jaw worked. That same microcompression Serafina had catalogued. The muscular precursor to either violence or capitulation. His body making decisions his mind had not yet authorized. "And if that is not enough," Aldrich finished his brandy, "then you better hope your wife loves that child more than she hates you, because right now, Caedric, that infant in the nursery is the only leverage you have left." The nursery existed in a different temporal zone than the rest of Blackthorne Keep. While the castle descended into political crisis and servants whispered in corridors and treasury officials sweated over financial projections, the nursery remained a pocket of enforced calm where the only sounds were breathing and the occasional creak of the wooden cradle rocking against the stone floor. Serafina had not slept. She sat in the same chair, wearing the same silk robe over surgical bandages, watching her son with the specific intensity of a woman who had learned through repetition that infants could stop breathing without warning. Martha entered with tea and linen, and the particular expression of a servant carrying information she was not certain she should deliver. "Say it," Serafina said without looking up. "The Castellan has been moving through the East Wing since before dawn. He visited the Treasury offices, the diplomatic correspondence room, and the military records archive. Renard is always moving through the East Wing. That is his function. At 4 in the morning, visiting rooms that require specific authorization?" Serafina's fingers paused on the cradle's edge, a stillness so precise it looked rehearsed. But Martha had served her long enough to recognize it as the opposite, the involuntary freeze of a predator detecting movement in peripheral vision. Which room specifically? The sealed archive, where the original Mordain Valicrest marriage contracts are stored. The silence that followed was not empty. It was loaded. The kind of silence that preceded artillery fire and the border conflicts Serafina had spent years financing from behind diplomatic curtains. Who authorized his access? No one, Your Grace. The Night Guard assumed standing authorization. Serafina processed this information the way she processed all threats, by mapping it against existing architecture. Renard Voss had served House Mordain for over 2 decades. His access to sensitive documents was routine. His movements through the castle were as predictable as tidal patterns, but tidal patterns changed during storms. Martha, Your Grace, I need the original copies of every financial instrument I signed before and during the marriage, not the official copies filed with the Imperial Registry, the originals, the ones kept in my private vault at the Southern Estate. Those would take 3 days to retrieve by courier. Then send 4 couriers on different routes. I want redundancy. Martha hesitated. You believe someone inside the castle is moving against you. Serafina looked at her son sleeping in the cradle, his fists curled, his mouth working against dreams of warmth and milk and the simple biological needs that consumed infants before the world taught them to want more complicated things. I believe, she said carefully, that I have spent 8 years watching my husband and not enough time watching the people who serve him. The Castellan trade delegation was not due until dawn the following day, but their advance party arrived by noon. 3 diplomatic carriages bearing the iron and wheat crest of the Castellan Confederacy rolled through Blackthorne's main gates, escorted by mounted guards whose armor gleamed with the particular polish of men expecting to be watched. Caedric received them in the great hall wearing full formal regalia and the expression of a man whose empire was not actively hemorrhaging beneath his feet. The performance was masterful. 16 years of political survival had trained him to project authority under conditions that would have shattered lesser men. He shook hands, made introductions, directed servants with the casual precision of someone for whom domestic control was reflexive rather than deliberate. Ambassador Elric Castellan, second son of the Confederacy's ruling house, 41 years old, built like a man who still trained with his soldiers instead of merely commanding them, watched the Duke with the patient assessment of a professional negotiator. Your Grace, congratulations on the birth of your heir. Thank you, Ambassador. The Duchy celebrates. And the Duchess? We were told the delivery was complicated. The pause before that final word carried diplomatic weight. Elric Castellan had not traveled 400 miles to discuss obstetric details. He had come because 3 separate intelligence sources had informed him that Blackthorne's financial infrastructure was experiencing unprecedented internal disruption. The birth was context. The disruption was the product. The Duchess is recovering well, Cedric answered smoothly. She sends her regrets that she cannot receive you personally. She looks forward to joining us for the formal dinner tomorrow evening. This was a lie. Serafina had not agreed to attend any formal dinner. Serafina had not agreed to anything. Serafina was currently sitting in a nursery 60 feet above their heads, dismantling economic agreements while their son slept against her chest. But Caedric understood something about political performance that most men learned too late. The appearance of stability was itself a form of stability. Markets did not collapse because of actual weakness. They collapsed because of perceived weakness. If the Castellan delegation believed the Duchess stood beside her husband, the financial disruption could be framed as administrative restructuring rather than marital warfare. If they learned the truth, Blackthorne would bleed investors within the week. We are honored to be here during such a significant moment for House Mordain, Elric continued, his eyes scanning the great hall with an intelligence that missed nothing. The birth of an heir. New trade possibilities. The Empire watches Blackthorne with great interest. The Empire always watches Blackthorne. Indeed, Elric smiled. Though recently, some have suggested the watching has become more mutual. The subtext was unmistakable. Elric Castellan knew about the financial fractures. The question was how much he knew and who had told him. Kedric's smile did not waver. Mutual observation is the foundation of productive alliance. I look forward to demonstrating exactly how productive our relationship can become. He held the ambassador's gaze for 3 seconds longer than diplomatic convention required, long enough to communicate that the Duke of Blackthorne recognized a probing attack when he encountered one, long enough to signal that the response would be disproportionate if the probing continued. Elric received the message. His smile became fractionally less confident. The formal reception lasted 2 hours. By its conclusion, Caedric had memorized every member of the Castellan advance party, cataloged their behavioral patterns, and identified which ones were genuine diplomats and which were intelligence operatives disguised as diplomatic staff. 3 operatives. Positioned at the edges of the gathering, watching servant movements and architectural details with the trained efficiency of people who had been instructed to map the castle's interior. Someone had briefed them before arrival. The information pipeline was already compromised. Caedric crossed the Great Hall after the delegation withdrew to their guest quarters and found Renard Voss organizing servant schedules near the kitchen corridor. "Renard, Your Grace." The Castellan's bow was flawless. 23 years of muscle memory producing the exact angle of deference that communicated respect without subservience. "The guest quarters are prepared. The delegation's dietary requirements have been accommodated. Shall I arrange the formal dinner for—" "Who accessed the sealed archive last night?" Renard's expression did not change. Not because he was controlling it, because the question did not surprise him, because he had anticipated it, because a man who had survived 23 years inside a house built on suspicion understood that anticipation was indistinguishable from innocence if performed correctly. "I did, Your Grace. Routine verification of the marriage contract provisions ahead of the trade negotiations. The Castellan alliance requires confirmation of succession legitimacy before ratifying commercial agreements. Standard protocol." Every word was true. Every word was also precisely calibrated to obscure the fact that Renard had spent 47 minutes in that archive photographing documents that had nothing to do with trade negotiations. Caedric studied his Castellan's face. 23 years of proximity had taught him the man's behavioral patterns with almost mechanical precision. The slight tilt of the chin when delivering unpleasant news, the softening of the voice when managing upward, the absolute stillness of the hands when concealing something significant. Renard's hands were still, perfectly still. "Standard protocol," Caedric repeated. "Yes, Your Grace." A different man might have pressed further, demanded specifics, ordered a review of the archive access records. But Caedric Mordain had survived 16 years of imperial politics by understanding one fundamental principle. The most dangerous threats were never the ones you could see. They were the ones embedded so deeply inside your own infrastructure that confronting them required dismantling the structure you relied on for survival. He could not afford to dismantle his household staff during the most critical negotiation of the decade. Ensure the archive is sealed with secondary authorization for the duration of the delegation's visit. "Of course, Your Grace." Renard bowed and walked toward the east wing. Caedric watched him go. Something cold moved through his chest. Not suspicion, exactly. Something older. The particular instinct that had kept him alive through border wars and assassination attempts, and the specific variety of political violence that operated through paperwork rather than blades. The instinct that told a man the ground beneath him was shifting even when the surface appeared stable. Evening brought fog. Thick maritime mist rolled inland from the coast and wrapped Blackthorne Keep in cotton-white blindness. Torches along the battlements burned as orange halos floating in gray nothing. The castle became an island separated from the world by vapor and silence. Celestine Vero packed her traveling case in the guest chamber assigned to her 6 months ago by a duke who had once valued her proximity above his own reputation. The summons had arrived an hour ago. Not from Caedric, from Aldrich Hale, written in the blunt military shorthand of a man who viewed diplomatic language as a waste of operational time. Vacate by midnight. Carriage arranged. Northern estate prepared. Do not attend dinner. Do not speak to press. Do not contact the Duke. Celestine read it 3 times. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and experienced something she had not permitted herself since the age of 14. She felt small, not defeated. Celestine Vero had been defeated before and recovered with the efficiency of someone who treated setbacks as data rather than verdicts. But small, reduced. The sensation of watching a door close while understanding that no amount of strategic positioning would reopen it. She thought about her father, the pistol in the study, the sound her mother made when the servants found him. Not a scream, something quieter and more permanent. The sound of a woman whose entire architecture of survival had been removed in a single percussion. Celestine folded silk garments into the case with precise movements. She was not her mother. She would not shatter. But she understood now, with the cold clarity of a woman packing her belongings while fog erased the world outside, that she had miscalculated the fundamental equation. She had believed Kaedric's attachment to her represented power, something she held, something the Duchess could not take. Instead, she was the thing being discarded to preserve the structure, not a partner. Inventory. She snapped the case shut. Some survival mechanisms worked by attachment, others worked by release. The skill was knowing which situation demanded which response before the situation decided for you. Celestine Vero left Blackthorne Keep at 11 minutes past 10. No one watched her carriage disappear into the fog. No one except Renard Voss, standing at a second-floor window with his hands clasped behind his back and an expression that contained neither satisfaction nor regret. Only calculation. Serafina learned of Celestine's departure from Martha at midnight. She received the information while nursing her son in the lamplight. The infant fed with the urgent, desperate intensity of all newborns, consuming warmth and sustenance as if the world might withdraw both at any moment. His small hand pressed against her collarbone. His eyes, not yet focused enough to distinguish faces, stared in her general direction with the blind trust of a creature who had no evidence yet that trust was dangerous. "He sent her away," Martha said quietly. Serafina adjusted the infant's position. "He sent her away before the delegation dinner. Not before. Not because of the birth. Because of the negotiation." Does the distinction matter? The distinction is everything. Serafina's voice carried the particular flatness that Martha had learned to recognize as the Duchess, operating at full analytical capacity. If he removed her out of guilt, it suggests emotional recalculation. That gives me a negotiating partner. If he removed her out of strategy, it means he is managing the crisis rather than addressing the cause. That gives me an opponent. And which do you believe? Serafina looked down at her son. His mouth had released. He slept now with milk drying on his lower lip and his breath coming in the soft, stuttering rhythm that she counted without thinking. 1, 2, 3, 4. Still breathing. "I believe," she said, "that Kaedric Mordain has never in his life made a decision based purely on emotion. Every choice runs through strategic calculation first, even grief, even love. Especially love." She paused. "But I also believe that somewhere beneath the calculation, something cracked tonight, something he cemented shut after our second child died. And cracked foundations are either repaired or they bring down the entire building. Which outcome do you want?" The question was not Martha's to ask. Both women knew it. Both women also knew that the formal boundaries between Duchess and servant had dissolved years ago through shared grief, shared intelligence operations, and the particular intimacy that developed between women who survived powerful men together. Serafina did not answer immediately. She looked at the window where fog pressed against the glass like something trying to communicate through a barrier it could not penetrate. "I want my son to grow up inside a structure that will hold." Her voice dropped. Whether that structure includes his father depends on whether his father can distinguish between possession and partnership before the walls come down. At that moment, 2 floors below and 3 corridors east, Renard Voss sat at his desk composing a second letter. This one addressed not to the Castellan delegation, but to a recipient whose identity he recorded only in cipher. The letter contained 3 items: A detailed inventory of the documents he had photographed in the sealed archive, a precise accounting of the financial disruption Serafina had initiated, including routing numbers, authorization codes, and the names of every banking official who had facilitated the transfers, and a timeline. 7 days. In 7 days, the information contained in this letter would reach its intended recipient. And when it did, both the Duke's military authority and the Duchess's financial control would become irrelevant. Because the person receiving this letter did not want Blackthorne's power. They wanted Blackthorne's destruction. Renard sealed the envelope with wax that bore no crest. He placed it inside a diplomatic pouch marked for routine correspondence, and he walked through the fog-choked corridors of Blackthorne Keep with the measured pace of a man who had been waiting 23 years for the precise moment when the family he served would tear itself apart cleanly enough for someone else to walk through the gap. The fog outside thickened until even the battlements disappeared. And inside the castle, a husband and wife prepared for the same negotiation from opposite ends of the same collapsing structure, neither yet aware that the ground they fought over had already been sold to someone else entirely. The formal dinner began at 8 o'clock with the precision of a military operation and the atmosphere of a funeral where the corpse had not yet been identified. Blackthorne Keep's grand dining hall stretched 70 feet beneath vaulted ceilings, painted with scenes of Mordain military victories so old the pigment had darkened into something that looked less like triumph and more like bloodstain. 400 candles burned in iron chandeliers suspended by chains thick enough to anchor warships. The table seated 42. Tonight, it held 19. The Castellan delegation on one side, Mordain household officials on the other, and at opposite ends of the polished oak surface, the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne occupying their respective positions like chess pieces placed on a board neither controlled. Serafina had come downstairs. That fact alone recalibrated every calculation in the room. She wore midnight blue, not silver. Not the Valacrest colors she had deployed at political events for the past 6 years. A deliberate departure that every diplomat present registered immediately. Midnight blue belonged to no house. It declared no allegiance. It communicated that the woman wearing it operated outside the established architecture of loyalty entirely. Her hair was pulled back in a style that exposed the surgical bruising along her jawline. She had not concealed it. Another deliberate choice. The fading purple and yellow along the left side of her face told a story that no amount of diplomatic performance could contradict. This woman had nearly died 3 days ago, and she was sitting at a negotiating table instead of a sickbed. Ambassador Elric Castellan watched her enter the room with the expression of a man revising intelligence assessments in real time. Cedric watched her too. He sat at the head of the table in full dress regalia with the imperial Mordain crest pinned at his throat. And for the first time in 16 years of political dinners, he was not the most dangerous person in the room. He knew it. The knowledge moved through his chest like ice water entering a cracked vessel. Every instinct built through decades of dominance told him to reassert control. Command the conversation, direct attention, manage the narrative the way he managed military campaigns, through superior positioning and overwhelming force. But Serafina's positioning tonight was not something force could overcome. She had placed herself at the opposite end of the table, maximum distance, maximum visibility. Every guest could see both of them simultaneously without turning their head. The spatial arrangement transformed a diplomatic dinner into a theater where the audience sat between two performers and could not avoid comparing them. Cedric in his military regalia, the conqueror, the force. Serafina in her bruised skin and neutral colors, the survivor, the cost. The first course arrived. Servants moved through the candlelight like ghosts trained in silverware choreography. Wine poured. Conversation flowed in the careful, shallow channels that diplomats used when the real negotiations had not yet begun. Elric Castellan engaged Cedric in discussions about northern border security, tactical questions, force deployment, the kind of military conversation that allowed powerful men to display competence without revealing vulnerability. Cedric performed brilliantly, every answer precise, every strategic assessment delivered with the casual authority of a man who had personally commanded the campaigns he discussed. His voice carried the specific gravity that made subordinates obey and rivals calculate whether confrontation was worth the cost. But between answers, his eyes tracked to Serafina. She was speaking with Deputy Ambassador Marin Castellan, Elric's younger sister, who functioned as the delegation's financial analyst and who possessed the disconcerting habit of asking questions that sounded casual but contained the structural precision of forensic accounting. "The Duchy's trade output has been remarkable," Marin observed, sipping wine without actually drinking. "Though our analysts noted some interesting fluctuations in the Valicrest-affiliated shipping corridors over the past 72 hours. Administrative restructuring," Serafina answered with a warmth that would have fooled anyone who did not know that warmth and honesty operated independently inside her. "The birth of an heir naturally triggers succession-related financial reviews. Standard protocol." "Of course," Marin smiled. "Though our standard protocol is to ask whether administrative restructuring includes the withdrawal of financial guarantees from ongoing military supply contracts." The table went quiet. Not silent. The distinction mattered. Quiet meant people were still breathing, still chewing, still maintaining the physical performance of a normal dinner. But every ear in the room redirected toward the conversation at Serafina's end of the table. Serafina set down her fork with the precise control of a woman choosing her next sentence the way a surgeon chose incision points. "Deputy Ambassador, I appreciate the directness. In my experience, financial questions disguised as casual dinner conversation produce less reliable answers than financial questions asked directly in formal negotiation." Marin's smile widened fractionally. "Then perhaps we should schedule that formal negotiation." "Perhaps we should." Cadric's hand tightened around his wine glass. He recognized what was happening. Marin Castellan was not probing Serafina. She was offering an alliance. The financial restructuring Serafina had initiated was not merely a weapon against Cadric. It was an invitation, a signal broadcast across every intelligence network in the Empire that Valicrest financial infrastructure was available for new partnerships. And the Castellan Confederacy had arrived ready to negotiate. Not with the Duke, with his wife. The realization hit Cadric with the physical force of a blow to the sternum. His lungs compressed. His vision narrowed for 2 seconds before training reasserted control over his autonomic responses. He had spent his entire career as the person other powers came to court, the person whose alliance was sought, whose approval was required, whose displeasure shaped policy across 3 provinces. Now he sat at his own table watching a rival power negotiate with his wife as if he were already irrelevant. "Ambassador Castellan," Cadric's voice cut across the table with enough force to stop every side conversation simultaneously. "I believe the formal negotiations are scheduled for tomorrow morning. Tonight is meant for celebration." Elric met his eyes. "Of course, Your Grace. We merely admire the Duchess's command of financial detail. It speaks well of Blackthorne's institutional strength." Institutional strength? The phrase was a knife wrapped in silk. It praised the duchy while attributing its strength to the woman Caedric had abandoned during childbirth. Every diplomat at that table understood the implication. Blackthorne's power did not reside where the Empire assumed it resided, and the Castellan delegation had arrived already knowing this, which meant someone had told them. Cadric's eyes moved across the room, past the delegates, past the servants, past the military staff positioned near the doors. He found Renard Voss standing near the service corridor. The Castellan held a wine decanter in one hand and a service cloth in the other. His posture was perfect, his expression neutral, his position unremarkable, exactly where a senior household official would stand during a formal dinner. But his eyes were not watching the table. They were watching Caedric, and in the fraction of a second before Renard's gaze shifted away, something passed across his features that Caedric had never seen in 23 years of proximity. Anticipation. The dinner concluded at 10:30. Delegates withdrew, servants cleared. The grand dining hall emptied until only the candles remained, burning down into pools of wax that spread across the iron chandeliers like slow-motion hemorrhages. Cadric intercepted Serafina in the corridor outside the private chambers. "We need to talk." "We needed to talk 3 days ago. You were occupied." "This is not about Celestine." Serafina stopped walking. In the torchlight of the corridor, the bruising along her jaw looked darker, more recent, as if the dinner itself had inflicted fresh damage. She turned to face him with the controlled precision of a woman whose surgical bandages still pulled against her abdomen with every breath. Then what is it about? Someone inside this castle is feeding information to the Castellan delegation, financial details they should not possess, structural intelligence about our operations they could not have obtained through external surveillance. Serafina studied him. For a moment, something almost resembling their original partnership flickered in the space between them. Two people who had once coordinated political strategy with the efficiency of a single mind operating through two bodies. You suspect Renard. It was not a question. I suspect everyone. But Renard accessed the sealed archive 2 nights ago. His explanation was procedurally sound. His behavior was procedurally perfect. And procedural perfection in a man who has served this house for 23 years is itself suspicious. People who have nothing to hide do not perform innocence. They simply are innocent. Serafina processed this. Her fingers pressed against the stone wall beside her, steadying herself against exhaustion that her posture refused to display. What do you want from me? Access to your intelligence network, your merchant contacts, your financial informants. I need to trace the information pipeline before the formal negotiations tomorrow. If the Castellans entered this castle already knowing our internal fractures, they will use that knowledge to extract concessions neither of us can afford. Neither of us. This affects you as much as it affects me, Serafina. If Blackthorne's negotiating position collapses, your financial restructuring becomes worthless. You cannot redirect trade routes through a duchy that hostile powers have already dismantled. She stared at him for a long time. The corridors stretched around them in both directions. Cold stone, flickering torches. The distant sound of wind pressing against battlements. The entire castle existed in a state of suspended animation. Fog outside. Fire inside. And between two people who had once shared a bed and 2 dead children, the specific silence of mutual calculation. I will give you the network access, she said finally. Not because I trust you, because whoever is operating inside these walls is a threat to our son, and I will align with anything, including you, to eliminate threats to that child. Kedrick nodded once. For a fraction of a second, something passed between them that was not strategic, not calculated. Something that existed underneath the years of diplomatic management and emotional withdrawal and carefully maintained distance. Something that felt almost like recognition. Then Serafina turned and walked toward the nursery, and Kedrick stood in the corridor feeling the ghost of that recognition fade like warmth leaving a room when the door closes. He went to work. Serafina's intelligence network was larger than he had imagined, not incrementally larger, categorically. What he had assumed was a collection of merchant contacts and financial informants turned out to be a fully operational intelligence apparatus embedded across every level of Blackthorne's administrative infrastructure. Servant loyalties that Kedrick believed belonged to his household actually reported through parallel chains of communication that Serafina had constructed over 6 years. Trade ministers who attended Kedrick's policy meetings also attended private briefings with Serafina's financial analysts. Military supply officers who processed Mordain weapons contracts simultaneously maintained records for Valacrest auditing purposes. The Duchess had not merely built a financial alternative to his military empire. She had built a shadow administration, and she had built it so quietly that the most paranoid duke in the empire never detected it. Kedrick sat in his study at 2 a.m, surrounded by intelligence reports, and felt something he had not experienced since the early years of the border wars. Awe. Not the comfortable awe of a man admiring a painting or a sunset. The destabilizing awe of a military commander realizing the enemy force was 10 times larger than estimated. The awe that preceded either strategic genius or catastrophic defeat, depending on whether the man experiencing it was capable of abandoning his original battle plan in time. He stared at the network diagram one of Serafina's analysts had provided. Lines of communication and financial control spreading across the duchy like root systems beneath a forest. Every line traceable. Every node identified. Except one. A gap in the network. A blind spot positioned precisely where the Castellans' quarters intersected with the diplomatic correspondence office. Serafina's people had flagged it 6 months ago as an anomaly, a corridor of communication that their surveillance could not penetrate. Someone had built a counterintelligence pocket inside Blackthorne Keep. and the only person with sufficient access and institutional knowledge to construct it was someone who had lived inside the castle's administrative infrastructure for over 2 decades. Cedric reached for the study door. It was already open. Reynard Voss stood in the doorway. He was not wearing his castellan's uniform. Instead, he wore a dark traveling coat and boots meant for distance rather than ceremony. His hands hung at his sides, empty, but his posture carried the specific readiness of a man who had already committed to a course of action that eliminated the possibility of reversal. "Your Grace," Reynard's voice was different. The deference was gone. 23 years of carefully modulated servility stripped away like plaster removed from a wall to reveal the original stone underneath. "I see you found the gap." Cedric's hand moved toward the desk drawer, where he kept a pistol loaded with the paranoid consistency of a man who had survived 3 assassination attempts. "I wouldn't," Reynard shook his head once. "Not because I'm armed, because what I'm about to tell you will change whether that pistol is pointed at me or at someone else. Talk. In approximately 4 hours, a courier will arrive at the Castellan delegation's quarters, carrying a diplomatic pouch. Inside that pouch are copies of every document from Blackthorne's sealed archive, including the original Mordain-Valacrest marriage contracts, military deployment schedules, financial authorization codes, and detailed intelligence regarding both your defensive capabilities and the Duchess's shadow network." The room temperature did not actually change, but Cedric's blood redirected from his extremities toward his core with the involuntary efficiency of a body preparing for combat. His fingers went cold. His vision sharpened. His breathing slowed to the rhythm of a man whose survival depended on processing information faster than the threat could evolve. "Who sent the courier?" "I did." Silence. The kind of silence that fills a room when the structural foundations shift beneath the floor. Not the absence of sound, the presence of something heavy enough to deform the space it occupied. 23 years, Cedric said. 23 years. Why? Renard's expression shifted. Not dramatically. A man who had spent 2 decades performing neutrality did not abandon the technique entirely, even during confession, but something surfaced beneath the controlled features. Something that looked less like betrayal and more like exhaustion. The specific fatigue of a person who had carried a weight so long that the act of setting it down felt more like collapse than relief. "Because you killed my brother." The words landed with surgical precision. Cedric's jaw locked. Not the micro-compression of political discomfort. Full muscular seizure. The response of a body absorbing impact it did not anticipate. Edric Voss was executed for treason during the border consolidation. Edric Voss was executed because he discovered your father was selling weapons to the same insurgents he publicly claimed to be fighting. He brought evidence to the military tribunal. Your father intercepted the testimony, reversed the charges, and had Edric hanged as a traitor in front of his own regiment. Renard's voice remained steady, but his hands betrayed him. A tremor in the left that spoke of years compressing this information into a space small enough to carry without visible damage. You were 19. You signed the execution order. You did not read the file. You trusted your father's assessment the way sons of powerful men always trust their fathers. Absolutely, and without verification. Cedric stared at him. Somewhere deep inside the architecture of his certainty, a support beam cracked. Not because the accusation was unfamiliar. He had signed hundreds of orders during the consolidation years. Military tribunals processed cases faster than individual review permitted. He signed what his father presented. He trusted the hierarchy that controlled information flow. He trusted the system, and the system had executed an innocent man. You could have confronted me at any point in 23 years, Cedric said. His voice had dropped to the register that men who knew him recognized as the most dangerous frequency. Quiet, almost gentle, the volume a predator used when distance was no longer a factor. Confrontation would have achieved nothing except my own execution. Your father taught you that power protects itself by eliminating threats. I needed to become something you could not eliminate. Something embedded so deeply inside your infrastructure that removing me would cause more damage than tolerating me. So you became indispensable. I became architecture. The word hung in the air between them. Architecture. The same word Kaedric used internally to describe his emotional defenses, his political strategies, his marriage, everything constructed, everything load-bearing, everything designed to prevent collapse while concealing the damage underneath. And now he learned that the man who maintained his castle had been engineering its demolition for over 2 decades. The Castellan Confederacy, Kaedric said, they're not here for trade negotiations. They're here for acquisition. The documents I provided give them legal grounds to challenge the Mordain-Valicrest marriage contract as a fraudulent instrument. Your father's weapons dealing constitutes undisclosed criminal activity that voids the legitimacy clause. Without that clause, the Valicrest bloodline connection dissolves. Without the bloodline connection, your succession claim becomes vulnerable to challenge. And without the succession claim, Blackthorne becomes contested territory that the Castellan Confederacy will petition the imperial court to absorb. Kaedric processed this with the cognitive speed of a man whose survival depended on it. Each piece clicked into position with the nauseating precision of a trap whose mechanism had been visible all along if he had only looked at the right angles. Renard had not betrayed him tonight. Renard had been betraying him since the day he arrived. Every act of loyalty, every efficient household operation, every perfectly managed dinner and flawlessly organized archive. All of it was scaffolding constructed around a demolition charge that had been waiting 23 years for the right moment to detonate. And the fracture between Duke and Duchess had provided exactly the structural weakness required. "Why tell me now?" Kaedric's voice was barely audible. "The courier arrives in 4 hours. The delegation has the information they need. You've already won." Renard looked at him, and for the first time in 23 years the mask dropped entirely. What lay beneath was not hatred, it was grief. "Because I watched your wife nearly die 3 nights ago while you sat in a music hall. I watched your son born into a house that is about to be destroyed. And I realized that the man I have spent 23 years punishing is not the man who killed my brother." His voice cracked along a fault line that 23 years of compression had created. "You were 19. You signed what your father gave you. You did not know." "That does not absolve me." "No, it does not, but it changes the mathematics of what I am willing to destroy." Renard reached into his coat and placed a sealed envelope on the desk. "The courier's route, departure point, arrival time, identification details. You have 4 hours to intercept the delivery before the Castellan delegation receives the archive documents." Kaedric stared at the envelope. "And if I fail? Then Blackthorne falls. Your son inherits nothing, and I disappear into a life that does not require me to serve the family that executed my brother." Renard turned toward the door. "Renard!" The Castellan stopped. "My father." Kaedric's voice sounded like something being torn along a seam. "The weapons dealing. Is there proof?" "The proof was in the file your father intercepted before the tribunal. I recovered copies during my first year in your service. They are in the sealed archive. The same archive I accessed 2 nights ago." He paused. "The same archive your Duchess's people have been monitoring." Then he walked through the door and vanished into the darkness of Blackthorne Keep's corridors. Kaedric stood alone in his study. The candles burned low. The intelligence reports spread across his desk now looked like artifacts from a civilization that had already fallen. Every map, every strategic assessment, every carefully constructed plan for the Castellan negotiation, all of it rendered obsolete by 12 minutes of conversation with a man he had trusted for 23 years. His hands pressed flat against the desk. His breathing came in controlled intervals that his body maintained through training, while his mind processed the specific devastation of learning that loyalty was not a resource but a performance. That trust was not structural but theatrical. That the man who organized his household had been disassembling his empire 1 document at a time for longer than his marriage had existed. 4 hours. 4 hours to intercept a courier carrying enough documentation to dissolve his dynasty. But the courier was not the only problem. The Castellan delegation already possessed partial intelligence. Marin Castellan's questions at dinner confirmed that. Intercepting the courier would prevent the final evidence delivery, but would not erase what the delegation already knew. To survive this, Kaedric needed more than interception. He needed alliance. He needed the one person whose intelligence network could identify what the Castellans already possessed, whose financial authority could block the legal challenge before it reached imperial courts, and whose political credibility could reframe the narrative before hostile powers finished constructing it. He needed his wife. The woman he had abandoned during the most vulnerable moment of her life. The woman whose financial infrastructure he had ignored for years. The woman who had built a shadow administration beneath his feet, while he held his mistress's hand and pretended the screaming was just the storm. Cedric Mordain had spent his entire adult life operating from a position of dominance. Every negotiation entered from strength. Every alliance built on the understanding that he held superior force. Every relationship, political, military, personal, structured so that he controlled the terms of engagement. Now he stood in his study at 2 a.m. with 4 hours until his empire collapsed, and the only path to survival required him to do something his entire identity had been constructed to prevent. Ask for help, not command it, not demand it, not negotiate for it from a position of strategic leverage. Ask. From a position of absolute vulnerability. He picked up the envelope Renard had left. He gathered the intelligence reports from Serafina's network. He assembled every document that demonstrated the scope of his father's crimes and his own unwitting complicity. Then he walked toward the nursery. Every step echoed through corridors that suddenly felt less like the hallways of a fortress and more like the interior of a structure whose foundation had been quietly removed while everyone inside continued living as if the floors were still solid. He reached the nursery door, his hand pressed against the iron handle, and Cedric Mordain, the most feared duke in the empire, the man who had ordered executions and commanded armies and treated vulnerability like a disease to be quarantined, stood in the darkness with his forehead against cold wood and felt the entire architecture of who he was begin to give way. Because the man who walked through that door could not be the same man who had stood in the music hall 3 nights ago. That man operated through control, through dominance, through the systematic elimination of everything that could not be managed. The man who walked through this door would need to do something different. He would need to be the kind of person who could look at the woman he had damaged and say the words that his father never taught him. The words that empire and conquest and 16 years of political survival had trained him to treat as structural weakness. I was wrong. I need you. Help me save what is left. Cedric opened the door. Inside, lamplight painted gold across a nursery where an infant slept in a cradle and a woman sat beside him counting breaths she was terrified of losing. Serafina looked up, and in her eyes, Cedric saw the calculation begin. The rapid, merciless assessment of whether the man standing before her was offering something real or performing another version of the strategic management that had defined every interaction between them for the past 6 years. He held out the documents. Everything. Renard's confession, his father's crimes, the courier timeline, the Castellan conspiracy, the scope of his own blindness laid bare on paper and carried across a castle in the hands of a man whose hands were shaking for the first time since he buried his second child. 4 hours, he said. His voice sounded like something that had been load-bearing for too long and finally reached the limit of what the material could sustain. We have 4 hours, and I cannot do this alone. The infant stirred in the cradle. Serafina looked at the documents, then she looked at her husband, and the calculation in her eyes shifted into something that was not forgiveness and not trust and not the partnership they had once pretended to share for political convenience. Something harder. Something that would either rebuild or bury them both. Serafina took the documents from his shaking hands without speaking. She spread them across the nursery floor beside the cradle where their son slept, and she read them the way she read everything, completely, systematically, and without allowing a single visible reaction to surface until the full architecture of the information had been processed and catalogued. Cedric stood near the door. He did not sit. Sitting implied comfort, and nothing about this moment permitted comfort. He watched his wife's eyes move across pages that described the systematic betrayal of his household by the man he had trusted most, and he experienced the particular vertigo of a person watching someone else examine the structural damage inside a building he had believed was sound. 7 minutes. She read for 7 minutes without speaking. The infant shifted in the cradle. A small sound, half breath, half protest, that filled the silence between pages turning. Then Serafina looked up. Your father sold weapons to border insurgents for at least 6 years. Yes. Renard's brother discovered this and was executed under falsified treason charges. Yes. And you signed the execution order without reading the evidence file. Cadrick's jaw locked. That micro-compression again, but deeper now. Structural rather than superficial. The muscular equivalent of a building settling on compromised foundations. I was 19. My father controlled information flow. I signed what he presented. That is an explanation. It is not an answer. He stared at her. The lamplight caught the surgical bruising along her jaw and the exhaustion lines around her eyes, and the particular stillness in her expression that he had learned years ago meant she was operating at maximum analytical capacity while simultaneously processing something emotional that she refused to display. Yes, he said. I signed it without reading it. Serafina held his gaze for 3 seconds. Then she gathered the documents into a single stack and rose from the floor with a controlled movement that caused her visible pain, the surgical bandages pulling against her abdomen, her left hand bracing momentarily against the cradle frame before her posture straightened into the rigid composure she maintained the way soldiers maintained body armor. The courier departs from the village relay station south of the river crossing. Renard's route information matches what my network flagged 6 months ago as an anomalous communication channel. The delivery window is narrow, between 5 and 6 in the morning, when the night patrol rotates and the southern gate operates with a single guard. Cadrick blinked. You already knew about the communication channel. I knew about the channel. I did not know who was operating it or what was being transmitted. My analysts flagged it as a potential smuggling route. We deprioritized it because the traffic volume was minimal. She set the documents on the table beside the lamp. That was my error. Minimal traffic from a disciplined operator does not mean minimal threat. It means patience. For the first time in years, Cadrick experienced the sensation of operating alongside Serafina rather than around her. The analytical speed, the immediate translation of information into tactical assessment, the complete absence of emotional interference in the processing chain, despite the fact that the information being processed concerned the potential destruction of everything they had built. He had forgotten what this felt like. Working with someone whose mind moved at the same velocity as his own. I need Aldrich and 4 riders at the southern gate within the hour, he said. If we intercept the courier before the relay, no. Cadrick stopped. Intercepting the courier solves the immediate delivery problem. It does not solve the Castellan problem. Elric already possesses partial intelligence. His sister confirmed that at dinner. If the courier fails to arrive, the delegation will know the pipeline was compromised. They will accelerate their timeline. File the legal challenge with the Imperial Court using whatever evidence they already possess. Partial evidence with a narrative of suppression is more damaging than complete evidence presented through normal channels. She was right. The recognition moved through Cadrick's chest like a blade turned sideways, not cutting, but pressing, displacing everything around it to make room for the uncomfortable truth that his instinct toward direct force was exactly the wrong response. Then what? Serafina walked to the nursery window. Fog still pressed against the glass, but the first suggestion of pre-dawn gray had begun to differentiate the darkness into layers. She stared into the murk the way generals stared at terrain before committing forces. We don't intercept the courier. We replace the contents. Cadrick's breathing stopped for 1 full second. We allow the delivery to proceed on schedule, but the documents inside the pouch will not be the archive materials Renard copied. They will be a curated selection of materials that I control. Documents that confirm your father's weapons dealing, because that truth cannot be suppressed, and attempting to suppress it will destroy us faster than the truth itself, but framed within a context that we author. What context? Reform. Serafina turned from the window. In the gray pre-dawn light mixing with lamplight, her face held the specific intensity of someone constructing a new architecture inside the ruins of a demolished one. Your father committed crimes. You inherited the consequences unknowingly. Upon discovery, you initiated internal investigation, financial restructuring, and institutional reform. The Valicrest financial withdrawal was not marital warfare. It was the Duchess protecting Empire assets from contaminated Mordain accounts pending audit completion. Cadrick stared at her. The strategic elegance was breathtaking. She was proposing to reframe their entire marital crisis, the public humiliation, the financial warfare, the Celestine scandal, as a coordinated reform operation. The Duke and Duchess working together to clean house. It transformed Serafina from abandoned wife to institutional guardian. It transformed Caedric from unfaithful husband to reform-minded leader. And it gave the Castellan delegation exactly what they wanted, confirmation of instability, while simultaneously demonstrating that the instability was being managed from within, eliminating the legal justification for external intervention. The Castellans will see through it, Caedric said. The Castellans will see a narrative that serves their interests better than confrontation. Right now, they're positioning for hostile acquisition. That requires imperial court approval, military standoff risk, and years of legal proceedings. I'm offering them a cooperative restructuring that gives them preferred trade access, succession security guarantees, and financial partnership. Everything they came to take by force, delivered voluntarily through alliance. You're offering them my empire. I'm offering them a seat at a table they were planning to overturn. The difference between alliance and conquest is that alliance requires the existing power structure to remain intact. If they accept, Blackthorne survives. If they refuse, they were never negotiating in good faith, and the imperial court will view their challenge as territorial aggression rather than legitimate legal action. Caedric processed this at the speed his training demanded, stripping away emotional response to evaluate pure strategic architecture. Every pathway mapped, every countermove anticipated, every contingency accounted for. It would work. If the replacement documents reached the courier pouch before departure. If Serafina's network could manufacture the supporting evidence quickly enough. If the Castellan delegation chose pragmatic alliance over punitive acquisition. And if Caedric was willing to do the one thing the strategy required that no document could accomplish. Stand before the Castellan delegation tomorrow morning and publicly acknowledge his father's crimes. Accept institutional responsibility. Submit Mordain military operations to external financial audit. Voluntarily surrender the absolute control he had spent 16 years accumulating. Become, in front of the entire empire, the man who chose accountability over domination. Every fiber of his psychological architecture resisted. The identity he had built since the age of 19 depended on impenetrability, on the perception that the Duke of Blackthorne operated from a position of unassailable strength. That perception kept enemies cautious, allies compliant, and the internal machinery of his psyche functioning despite damage that would have destroyed a less rigidly constructed personality. Admitting his father's crimes publicly would not merely damage that perception. It would demolish it. He would be the Duke whose father was a criminal, the Duke who inherited a fraudulent dynasty, the Duke who did not read the file before signing an innocent man's death warrant. Everything he feared being seen as, everything he had constructed his entire adult identity to prevent. Caedric. Serafina's voice cut through the spiral with the precision of someone who recognized psychological freefall because she had experienced it herself, during childbirth, during the deaths of their first 2 children, during the specific moment 3 nights ago when she heard music playing while she bled. Look at me. He looked. I am not asking you to destroy yourself. I am asking you to survive by becoming something your father never was. Something this empire has never seen from a Mordain. What? Honest. The word hit with the force of something that had been traveling a very long distance before impact. Honest. Not strategic, not diplomatic, not calibrated for maximum political effect. Honest. Caedric closed his eyes. Behind the darkness of his eyelids, he saw the execution order he had signed at 19. Black ink on heavy paper. A man's name. Edric Voss. Written in the formal script of military tribunals. A crime he did not commit. A death Caedric authorized without reading the evidence because his father told him it was necessary, and he believed his father the way 19-year-olds believe their fathers. Absolutely. Catastrophically. He opened his eyes. Tell me what you need. Serafina moved immediately. The transition from strategic discussion to operational execution happened with a fluidity that revealed how long she had been functioning as a covert operations commander, while the Empire believed she was merely a duchess. Martha. Now. I need 3 couriers from my personal network. not household staff. I need access to the document preparation room in the East Wing, and I need Aldrich Hale in this nursery within 15 minutes. Aldrich? Because the courier replacement requires someone the Southern Gate Guards recognize and trust implicitly. Aldrich is the only person besides you and Renard with standing authorization to access the diplomatic pouch system after midnight. Kedrick moved toward the door, then stopped. Renard. What about him? He told me. He revealed the entire operation. He gave me the courier route. He could have let the delivery proceed and disappeared. He chose to warn me. He chose to give himself an exit strategy that did not require living with the destruction of a child who had nothing to do with his brother's death. Serafina's voice carried something that was not sympathy exactly, but recognition. The particular understanding of a person who had spent years operating inside the gap between what people did and why they did it. Renard is not an ally, but he is not purely an enemy. He is a man who carried vengeance for 23 years and discovered at the moment of execution that vengeance is a structure that collapses once it achieves its purpose. Kedrick absorbed this. Then he went to find Aldrich. The next 90 minutes moved with the compressed intensity of a military operation conducted under conditions where failure was not a tactical setback, but an existential termination. Aldrich Hale received the briefing in the nursery while the infant slept 3 feet away, absorbing tactical intelligence about a 23-year conspiracy in a room that smelled like milk and clean linen and the particular warmth generated by very small humans who had no concept of the geopolitical crisis occurring around their cradle. He listened without interrupting. His scarred jaw tightened progressively as the scope of Renard's betrayal became clear. When Kedrick finished, Aldrich stood in silence for approximately 10 seconds. You want me to access the diplomatic pouch at the Southern Relay, replace the contents with documents the Duchess prepares, and allow the courier to proceed to the Castellan delegation as if nothing changed? Yes. And you understand that if the replacement is detected, if the courier inspects the contents, if the pouch shows signs of tampering, if the Castellan intelligence operatives are monitoring the relay station, then we have not merely failed to prevent the original delivery. We have demonstrated active interference with diplomatic communications, which gives the Castellans grounds for immediate military escalation under imperial treaty law. I understand. Aldrich looked at Serafina. She met his gaze with the steady composure of someone who had calculated the risk before proposing the operation and accepted it the way she accepted every risk, by determining that the alternative was worse. You built the shadow network, Aldrich said. Not a question. Yes. For how long? 6 years. Aldrich exhaled slowly. Something shifted in his expression. The professional reassessment of a military commander who had just learned that the strategic landscape contained an entire force he had not accounted for. I always wondered why the merchant guilds cooperated with Mordain tax assessments without resistance. I assumed it was fear. It was management. Aldrich almost smiled. Almost. The expression died before it reached completion, killed by the urgency pressing against every second that passed. Get me the replacement documents within the hour. I need to reach the relay station before the pre-dawn patrol change. Martha appeared with 3 leather folios containing blank documents bearing Valicrest financial seals. Serafina sat at the nursery table and began writing with a speed and precision that transformed the act of document preparation into something that looked less like administrative work and more like a weapon being assembled from components. Kedrick watched her write. Her hand moved across paper with the fluency of a person who had spent years drafting financial instruments, intelligence reports, and diplomatic correspondence in the shadows beneath his empire. Every sentence structured for legal durability. Every figure verifiable against existing imperial records. Every claim calibrated to be devastating enough to demonstrate genuine reform without being catastrophic enough to trigger the institutional collapse it was designed to prevent. She was building a controlled detonation, demolishing just enough of the old structure to make room for something new while preserving the load-bearing walls that kept everything standing. Kedrick picked up pages as she finished them. He read each one with the attention he should have given Edric Voss's execution file 19 years ago. Every word, every implication, every consequence. His father's weapons dealing, documented with evidence trails that Renard had unknowingly preserved by photographing the archive files. The falsified tribunal, the execution, the 23 years of institutional corruption that Kaedric had inherited without examination. And between the lines of evidence and financial restructuring, something else. A portrait of a man who had governed through fear because fear was the only instrument his father taught him to play, who married a woman for political advantage and then failed to recognize that she was the most valuable strategic asset in his entire empire, who buried 2 children and cemented the grief into walls so thick that nothing could reach the person trapped behind them. Serafina was not merely preparing documents for the Castellan delegation. She was writing the first honest account of House Mordain ever committed to paper, and she was doing it in a nursery while their 3rd child slept, because the only place in Blackthorne Keep that contained both truth and new life was this room. Aldrich departed at 4:17 with the replacement documents secured inside a military dispatch case. He rode south through fog so dense his horse moved by memory rather than sight, navigating the castle's outer roads toward the river crossing where the relay station operated in the pre-dawn darkness. Kaedric and Serafina stood in the nursery and waited. Waiting was worse than action. Action consumed attention. Action demanded decisions, movement, the physical engagement of body and mind in tasks that prevented the psyche from examining its own damage. Waiting offered nothing except time and the thoughts that filled it. "If this fails," Kaedric said, "I want you to take our son to the Valicrest Southern Estate. Your family's security forces can protect you there. File for legal separation under the Maternal Protection Act. The Imperial Court will grant it given the circumstances. Your financial assets are already isolated from Mordain accounts. You and the child will be—" "Stop." Serafina's voice was quiet, but carried enough weight to halt his sentence mid-construction. "You are planning your exit while standing next to a cradle. Do you understand what that communicates?" "I am planning contingencies. It is what I do." "It is what you do instead of being present." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The precision of the observation functioned like a scalpel, too sharp to feel immediately, the pain arriving seconds after the cut. "You planned contingencies instead of attending the birth. You planned contingencies instead of processing our children's deaths. You planned contingencies instead of maintaining your marriage. You have spent your entire life preparing for the worst possible outcome as a substitute for engaging with the actual present moment." Kaedric's breathing changed. Not dramatically. A slight deepening. A fractional increase in the pause between inhale and exhale. The physiological signature of a man whose defensive architecture had just been accurately described by someone standing inside the blueprint. "And what would you have me do instead?" Serafina looked at the cradle. Their son slept with his mouth slightly open and his fists curled against his cheeks. The lamplight made his skin look golden, made him look like something more permanent than he actually was, because infants were not permanent. Serafina knew this with the specific knowledge of a woman who had held 2 impermanent infants and counted their breaths until the breathing stopped. "Stay," she said, "in this room, in this moment, without calculating what happens if the room catches fire." Kaedric looked at his son, and something inside his chest, something located behind the cemented walls and the load-bearing grief and the architectural defenses constructed over 19 years of ruling through fear, shifted. Not collapsed, shifted. The way tectonic plates shifted. Slowly, with enormous pressure. Creating space that had not existed before. Space that might become a fault line or might become a foundation, depending on what was built over it. He stepped closer to the cradle, his hand extended toward the sleeping infant. Stopped. Hovered above the blanket with the trembling uncertainty of a man who had touched weapons and treaties and the handles of coffins but had somehow never learned to touch the thing he was most afraid of losing. Serafina watched his hand. She did not guide it, did not encourage it, did not offer the words that a more sentimental story might have provided. Words of comfort, of reassurance, of the kind of emotional coaching that would have reduced a complicated man to a simple lesson. She simply waited. Kaedric's fingers brushed his son's forehead. The infant was warm, warm in the way that only living things were warm. Not the heat of fire or metal or the friction generated by political machinery. Biological warmth, The temperature of blood moving beneath skin, of cells dividing, of a body too new to have learned that the world was anything other than warmth and milk, and the steady heartbeat of the person who held you. His hand trembled against that warmth, and he let it tremble because there was no one in this room he needed to perform strength for. Not anymore. The audience was gone. The diplomats were asleep. The Castellan had confessed. The mistress had vanished into fog. And the wife standing beside him had already seen everything behind the walls he had spent 2 decades building. There was nothing left to protect. Nothing except this. A sound reached them from outside. Hoofbeats on stone. Distant but approaching through the fog with the urgency of a horse being ridden at speed by someone who understood that the difference between a dynasty surviving and collapsing was measured in minutes. Cedric and Serafina moved to the window simultaneously. Through the fog, a single rider materialized at the southern gate. Aldrich's silhouette, recognizable by the particular forward lean of a man riding with a limp, crossed the courtyard at a gallop and disappeared toward the stable block. 2 minutes later, footsteps echoed in the corridor outside the nursery. The door opened. Aldrich stood in the threshold. His riding coat was soaked. Mud streaked his boots and the left side of his face where fog-blind branches had caught him on the forest road. He breathed in the hard, controlled rhythm of a man who had pushed his body past fatigue into the zone where physical function operated on discipline rather than energy. His expression told them everything before he spoke. The exchange is done. The courier departed on schedule with the replacement documents. No inspection, no tampering detection. The relay station guard logged the transaction as routine. Cedric exhaled, but Aldrich was not finished. There is a problem. The temperature in the nursery dropped by degrees that had nothing to do with weather. The Castellan delegation did not come with 3 intelligence operatives. They came with 7. I spotted 4 additional personnel positioned along the southern road during my return. They were not watching the relay station. They were watching the castle approaches. Cedric's strategic mind engaged with the cold snap of a mechanism triggered by threat detection. Perimeter surveillance. Active perimeter surveillance. They have been monitoring all traffic in and out of Blackthorne since before the dinner, which means they saw me leave. They will have logged my departure time, direction, and return. When the courier arrives with replacement documents, the timeline will not match what their surveillance recorded. Serafina processed this faster than Cedric. They will know the pouch was accessed between Renard's handoff and the courier's departure. The documents will be suspect regardless of content. How long before the courier reaches the delegation? Cedric asked. Less than an hour. The delegation's morning briefing begins at 7. If their operatives report the timeline discrepancy before the documents are reviewed, Elric Castellan will know the contents were manipulated. Cedric looked at Serafina. She looked back, and between them, in the space above a sleeping infant's cradle, a decision formed that neither of them could make alone. We go to them, Serafina said, before the courier arrives. Before the morning briefing. We walk into the Castellan delegation's quarters and we present the information ourselves, directly, without intermediaries, without diplomatic packaging, without the courier serving as a buffer between us and the evidence. That eliminates the replacement strategy entirely. The replacement strategy is already compromised. If we wait for the courier and the timeline discrepancy surfaces, we look like conspirators trying to suppress evidence. If we present the information ourselves before the courier arrives, we look like leaders who discovered internal corruption and chose transparency over concealment. They will still have Renard's original documents. Let them. Serafina's voice hardened into something that sounded like steel being shaped by heat, not brittle, but forged. Renard's documents confirm the crimes. Our presentation contextualizes them. The question the Castellan delegation will face is not whether House Mordain has institutional corruption. It does. The question is whether the current leadership is willing to address it openly or whether they will attempt to bury it the way Cedric's father buried Edric Voss. The nursery fell silent except for the infant's breathing and the distant sound of Blackthorne Keep groaning against the wind as dawn approached through fog that was just beginning to thin. Cedric stood at the center of the room between his sleeping son and his wife, and his scarred military advisor, and he understood with the absolute clarity of a man who had finally reached the bottom of every strategy, every contingency, every exit plan. There was no calculated path forward. There was only the choice. Walk into a room full of hostile diplomats and admit everything. The crimes, the cover-up, the affair, the failed marriage, the dead children. The fortress of fear and control built over the ruins of a dynasty founded on fraud. Or stay behind the walls and watch those walls come down around his son's cradle. Aldrich. His voice did not shake. Something beyond shakiness. Something that had passed through trembling and emerged on the other side into the specific steadiness of a man who had stopped trying to control the outcome and started trying to survive the truth. Wake the delegation, all of them. Tell them the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne request an emergency diplomatic session. At 5 in the morning? At 5 in the morning, Aldrich looked between them. The scarred military commander who had spent 15 years telling Kaedric the truth, whether he wanted to hear it or not, studied the two people standing in the nursery lamplight and saw something he had never seen before. Not the Duke and his political asset, not the conqueror and his bloodline guarantee. Two people standing on the same side of a collapsing structure for the first time in their marriage. He nodded once and left. Kaedric turned to Seraphina. Whatever happens in that room, whatever comes out of this, I need you to know something that I should have said 3 nights ago in this nursery instead of what I actually said. She waited. I was not managing political matters while you gave birth. His voice fractured along the fault line that had been forming since Renard's confession. I was hiding from the possibility that this child would die too. From the knowledge that if I stood beside you and watched it happen again, whatever is left inside me that still functions would stop functioning permanently. Seraphina stared at him. That is not an excuse, he continued. It is the truth. And I have spent so many years confusing strategy for honesty that I am no longer certain I know how to tell the difference. But this is not strategy. This is a man telling his wife that he was afraid, and that the fear made him cruel, and that the cruelty cost him everything worth keeping. The nursery held its breath. Seraphina stepped toward him, close enough that the space between them contained nothing except lamplight, and the fading smell of surgical bandages and the particular electrical charge generated by two people standing at the exact point where their shared history could either annihilate or reconstruct them. Then show them that, she said quietly. Walk into that room and show them the man I married before he disappeared. Dawn cracked the horizon with a thin line of red that bled through the thinning fog like a wound opening across the sky. Inside Blackthorne Keep, servants scrambled to light the formal conference chamber as an emergency diplomatic session was called, at an hour when no diplomatic session had ever been convened in the castle's 400-year history. The Castellan delegation assembled in various states of alertness. Elric, with the composed readiness of a man accustomed to irregular operations, Marin, with the sharp focus of someone whose analytical mind engaged fully within seconds of waking, and the 7 intelligence operatives positioned around the room's perimeter with the specific tension of professionals who understood that pre-dawn meetings in hostile territory rarely produced comfortable outcomes. The doors opened. Kaedric and Seraphina entered together, side by side. Not the strategic spacing of political partners maintaining individual positioning, shoulder to shoulder. The physical configuration of two people who had decided that the distance between them had already cost more than either could afford. Elric Castellan stood. Your Grace, this is unexpected. Kaedric stopped at the center of the room. He carried no documents, no diplomatic portfolio, no prepared remarks. He stood before the most significant foreign delegation his duchy had hosted in a decade, and he carried nothing except the truth and the woman beside him who had spent 6 years building the infrastructure that kept that truth from burying them both. Ambassador Castellan, Kaedric said, in approximately 40 minutes, a courier will deliver a diplomatic pouch to this delegation containing documents from Blackthorne's sealed archive. Every operative in the room shifted position simultaneously. Elric's expression recalibrated. We were not expecting I know what you were expecting. I know what the documents contain. And I know who provided them to you. The room became very still. Before those documents arrive, I am going to tell you what they reveal. Not because I have been caught, because my wife and I have decided that Blackthorne will no longer be governed by the lies my father embedded in its foundations. He looked at Seraphina. She looked back. And Cedric Mordain, the Duke who ruled through fear, who treated vulnerability like a disease, who held his mistress's hand while his wife gave birth in silence, opened his mouth and began dismantling the only version of himself he had ever known. Outside, dawn spread across the mountains like fire-consuming old architecture, and inside Blackthorne Keep, the sound of a man choosing honesty over survival echoed through stone corridors where 23 years of carefully constructed deception had just run out of time. Cedric spoke for 47 minutes. He did not use notes. He did not reference prepared documents or rehearse diplomatic language or the careful, calibrated phrasing that 16 years of imperial politics had trained him to deploy like armor between himself and accountability. He stood in the center of the formal conference chamber at 5 a.m. with his wife beside him and 19 hostile diplomats watching, and he dismantled the mythology of House Mordain with the systematic precision of a man pulling load-bearing walls out of a building he had finally decided to rebuild from the foundation up. He told them about his father's weapons dealing, the falsified tribunal, the execution of Edric Voss, the 23 years during which his Castellan had operated a parallel intelligence operation inside the most secure household in the Empire, while the Duke who prided himself on absolute control never detected a single anomaly. He told them about the financial architecture Serafina had constructed beneath his military empire, the shadow administration, the merchant networks, the parallel supply chains that had quietly underwritten every military victory the Empire credited to Mordain force. He told them about the affair, not in clinical terms, not as political context. He told them about the music hall and the birthing chamber and the specific moral architecture of a man who chose another woman's admiration over his wife's survival because admiration was easier to process than the kind of love that required him to be present for outcomes he could not control. The room did not move. Elric Castellan sat with his hands folded on the conference table and his expression locked into the professional neutrality of a diplomat whose intelligence assessments were being simultaneously confirmed and exceeded by information he had not anticipated receiving directly from the source. Myron Castellan had stopped writing notes. Her pen rested against the page and her eyes studied Cedric with the particular focus of someone revising not merely their strategic calculations, but their fundamental assumptions about the man delivering them. When Cedric finished, the silence that followed was not the tactical silence of diplomats calculating responses. It was something rarer. The silence of a room full of professional cynics confronting the possibility that what they had just witnessed was genuine. Elric spoke first. "Your Grace." His voice carried the careful weight of a man choosing his next sentence with full awareness that it would define the trajectory of two empires. "In 30 years of diplomatic service, I have never witnessed a sitting head of state voluntarily disclose institutional corruption of this magnitude. I am aware of the precedent. You are also aware that this disclosure gives the Castellan Confederacy legal standing to challenge every trade agreement, military treaty, and succession guarantee executed under Mordain authority during the period of your father's criminal activity." "I am. And you are proceeding regardless." Cedric looked at Serafina. She stood slightly behind his left shoulder, close enough that her presence was unmistakable, but positioned to communicate that this disclosure was his to deliver. Not hers. Not a joint performance. A man taking ownership of damage he had inherited, perpetuated, and finally chosen to expose. "Ambassador Castellan, I spent my entire adult life believing that the measure of a ruler was the territory he held and the fear he commanded. My father taught me that power was possession. I inherited his empire, his methodology, and his crimes without examining any of them, because examination would have required me to question the only model of leadership I understood." He paused. Not for dramatic effect, because the next sentence required him to cross a threshold he had never approached in 16 years of public speech. "I was wrong. About power, about leadership, about what it costs to maintain control through fear versus what it builds to lead through accountability. And the proof of how wrong I was is standing beside me. A woman who constructed a more resilient empire in secret than I managed to build in plain sight because she understood something I refused to learn." "Which is?" Elric asked. Cedric's voice dropped, not to the dangerous quiet of a man threatening violence, to the register of someone speaking from a depth he had only recently discovered existed beneath the strategic surface he had mistaken for his entire personality. That the structures which survive are the ones built on foundations people chose to trust, not foundations they were forced to fear. Marin Castellan leaned forward. Your Grace, the philosophical framework is noted, but this delegation was dispatched to negotiate trade agreements, not to witness institutional confession. What specifically are you proposing? Serafina stepped forward. The shift was seamless. Kaedric establishing the moral context, Serafina translating it into operational architecture. Two people who had spent 6 years building parallel empires in opposition now channeling that combined capacity toward a single objective for the first time. Deputy Ambassador, what we are proposing is a restructured alliance built on the following framework. Serafina's voice carried the same analytical precision that had constructed a shadow financial empire, but aimed now toward construction rather than leverage. Full financial transparency between Blackthorne and the Castellan Confederacy. Joint oversight of military supply chains formerly controlled exclusively by Mordain authority. Preferred trade access through Valacrest shipping corridors. And succession guarantees backed not by a single bloodline claim, but by institutional stability verified through independent audit. You are offering us everything we came to take, Marin observed. I am offering you more than you came to take. You came to acquire a damaged duchy through hostile legal action. I am offering you a functioning partnership with the most strategically positioned territory in the Empire, operated by leadership that has demonstrated willingness to reform rather than conceal. The market value of that distinction is considerably higher than the cost of administering a conquered territory through occupation. Elric studied both of them. The professional calculation visible in his eyes moved through stages that Kaedric recognized from years of watching diplomats process unexpected strategic proposals. Initial skepticism, structural analysis, risk assessment, opportunity mapping. We will require verification, Elric said finally. Independent audit teams, access to the sealed archive, formal imperial court documentation of the criminal disclosures. Agreed, Kaedric said. And the Castellan, Renard Voss. The name settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water. Kaedric's jaw tightened. That old reflex. But what moved beneath the muscular compression was not the rage or the strategic calculation that had driven that response for 16 years. Something different. Something he did not yet have a name for, but recognized the way a person recognized a landscape they had only seen in photographs. Familiar in structure, but overwhelming in actual scale. Renard Voss will be offered full immunity from prosecution in exchange for complete testimony regarding my father's criminal activities. His brother's case will be reopened through the Imperial Tribunal system. If the tribunal confirms that Edric Voss was wrongfully executed, House Mordain will issue formal acknowledgement and financial restitution to the Voss family. The room absorbed this. Marin set down her pen. Your Grace, I need to ask a question that is not strictly within my diplomatic authority, but which I believe is relevant to the structural assessment my delegation must perform. Ask? Do you actually believe what you're saying, or is this the most sophisticated damage control operation I have ever witnessed? The question was impolite by diplomatic standards. It was also the most important question anyone in that room could have asked. Kaedric did not answer immediately. He looked at the conference table. The polished oak surface that had hosted 100 diplomatic performances, 1,000 calculated statements, an entire career's worth of strategic language designed to project strength while concealing damage. 48 hours ago, I sat in a music hall holding another woman's hand while my wife hemorrhaged in a birthing chamber. I did this because I was terrified that my third child would die the way my first two died. And I had spent so many years converting fear into strategy that I no longer knew how to simply be afraid. I chose performance over presence, control over vulnerability, and it cost me the trust of the only person in this empire whose trust was actually worth having. He looked at Marin. I do not know if I believe what I'm saying in the way you mean. I know that the alternative, continuing to operate the way my father taught me, will destroy my son's inheritance, my wife's partnership, and whatever remains of the man I was before I learned to hide behind power. Whether that constitutes belief or simply the exhaustion of every other option, I will leave for your assessment. Marin held his gaze for a long time. Then she picked up her pen and began writing. The formal negotiations lasted 3 days. 3 days of financial restructuring, treaty revision, and institutional framework development conducted in the conference chamber where Caedric had delivered his disclosure. 3 days during which the Duke and Duchess of Blackthorne sat on the same side of the negotiating table for the first time in their political careers, presenting a unified strategic front built not on the illusion of marital harmony, but on the demonstrated reality of complementary expertise. Caedric handled military and territorial provisions. Serafina handled financial and commercial architecture. The division of responsibility was not performed for the delegation's benefit. It was the organic expression of a partnership that had always existed in potential but had been prevented from functioning by a man's insistence on controlling every dimension of power simultaneously. The Castellan delegation watched this dynamic with professional fascination. What they witnessed was not a duke commanding and a duchess complying. It was two strategic minds operating in coordinated parallel, each covering territory the other could not, each strengthening positions the other established, each demonstrating a level of institutional competence that made the prospect of hostile acquisition look increasingly foolish compared to cooperative alliance. On the third evening, Elric Castellan signed the revised trade agreement in the Great Hall. The document bore both the Mordain military seal and the Valicrest financial crest. Dual authority. Joint governance. The first treaty in Blackthorne's history that formally acknowledged what Serafina had known for years, that the duchy's power had never resided in a single house. After the signing ceremony, Elric requested a private moment with Caedric. They stood on the battlements overlooking the valley below Blackthorne Keep. The fog had lifted days ago, and the landscape spread in winter clarity. Forests, farmland, river systems, and the distant gray line of mountains marking the northern border. The territory Caedric's father had built through violence and fraud, maintained through fear, and nearly lost through the compounding consequences of unexamined inheritance. "You understand," Elric said, "that the imperial court will investigate your father's activities. The findings will be public. The Mordain reputation will sustain damage that diplomatic agreements cannot mitigate." "I understand." "And you accept this?" Caedric looked across the landscape. Somewhere down there, beyond the forest line, Renard Voss was traveling toward the capital under military escort to deliver testimony that would formally dismantle the mythology Caedric's father had constructed. The Castellan had accepted immunity with the quiet composure of a man whose 23-year operation had concluded in a way he had not anticipated but could accept. Not vindication, not victory. Something more complicated and less satisfying. The resolution of a burden carried so long that its removal felt more like surgery than relief. "My father built this empire on a lie," Caedric said. "I maintained it through ignorance and then through the kind of willful blindness that powerful men specialize in, the ability to not examine the foundations because the view from the top was too valuable to risk." He turned to Elric. "My son will not inherit that blindness. If the price of that is public damage to a reputation built on fraud, then the reputation was never worth protecting." Elric studied him for a long moment. "I have negotiated with your family for 12 years, Your Grace. This is the first conversation in which I believe I am speaking with the actual person rather than the performance." Caedric almost smiled. Almost. The expression reached his eyes, but not his mouth. A partial emergence, like something learning to surface after years submerged. "The performance was all I had for a very long time. And now? Now I have a wife who built a better empire than mine while I was not paying attention, a son who will need a father rather than a strategist, and the wreckage of every assumption I have operated under since I was 19 years old. That sounds like a foundation. It sounds like rubble." "Same thing," Elric said, "depending on what you build with it." The delegation departed the following morning. Caedric and Serafina stood on the main steps of Blackthorne Keep and watched the carriages descend the mountain road toward the valley. The morning air carried the sharp clarity of early winter, cold enough to make breathing visible, clean enough to make distance feel negotiable. When the last carriage disappeared beyond the tree line, the courtyard fell quiet. Servants moved through their routines. Guards changed positions on the battlements. The administrative machinery of the duchy continued its daily function with the institutional persistence of systems designed to operate regardless of the humans nominally controlling them. Serafina turned toward the castle entrance. "I'm going to the nursery." "I know." She paused, looked at him. Not the strategic assessment she had maintained throughout their marriage, the constant calculation of threat and opportunity, and the precise calibration of emotional distance required to survive proximity to a man who treated intimacy like a liability. Something different. She looked at him the way a person looked at a landscape after a storm had passed through and rearranged everything, recognizing the familiar elements, the terrain, the basic geography, the structural features that persisted despite the damage, but seeing them in new relation to each other, displaced, rearranged, potentially configurable into something that had not existed before the storm. "Come with me," she said. 2 words. Not a command, not a strategic directive, not the carefully modulated request of a duchess managing a duke. An invitation. Cedric heard it for what it was, and the simplicity of it, the absence of calculation, the directness of a woman who had decided to stop managing and start asking, reached past every remaining defense with the efficiency of something too small and too precise to be stopped by structures designed to resist larger forces. "Yes," he said. They walked through Blackthorne Keep together. The corridors that had served as boundaries between their separate territories for 6 years now functioned simply as hallways, stone passages connecting rooms in a building they both inhabited. Servants who had spent years navigating the political geography of the Duke's wing versus the Duchess's wing watched them pass with expressions ranging from confusion to cautious relief. The nursery was warm. Martha had maintained the fire through the night, the lamplight mixed with pale winter sun filtering through windows that overlooked the valley. The cradle sat near the center of the room, positioned equidistant from the fireplace and the window. Warm, but not overheated, lit but not glaring. Martha's spatial intelligence applied to infant care with the same precision she applied to intelligence operations and household management. The child was awake. He lay in the cradle with his eyes open, staring at the ceiling with the unfocused intensity of a 2-week-old infant processing visual information for the first time. His hands moved in small, uncoordinated gestures, reaching for nothing, grasping at air, practicing the mechanics of physical interaction with a world he had no context for yet. Serafina lifted him from the cradle and held him against her shoulder, the practiced motion of a woman who had done this thousands of times in 2 weeks, developing the particular muscular memory that infants demanded, the specific angle of support, the precise pressure of the hold, the constant micro-adjustments that kept a small body secure against a larger one. She looked at Cedric. He stood near the cradle, 3 feet away, the same distance he had maintained during their conversation after the birth, the same distance he maintained in every intimate situation, close enough to participate, far enough to withdraw. "Come closer," she said. He stepped forward. "Hold him." Cedric's hands extended. The same trembling from the night before the Castellan confrontation, the physiological signature of a man whose body remembered holding infants who stopped breathing, whose muscle memory contained the weight of 2 small bodies wrapped in white linen and placed in marble tombs. Serafina transferred their son into his arms. The infant settled against Cedric's chest with the instinctive adjustment of a creature responding to warmth and heartbeat and the particular security of being held by someone large enough to constitute a complete environment. His head found the hollow beneath Cedric's collarbone. His fist curled against the fabric of his father's shirt. His breathing shifted into the slower rhythm of comfort. Cedric held his son, not for the diplomatic benefit of appearing paternal, not for the strategic purpose of demonstrating reformed character to an audience that no longer existed, not for any reason that could be mapped onto the grid of political calculation that had governed every action he had taken for 16 years. He held his son because his son was warm and alive and breathing, and because the man holding him had finally exhausted every alternative to simply being present in the moment where he stood. Something released inside his chest, not dramatically, not the cinematic collapse of a dam or the theatrical shattering of a wall, something quieter, more structural. The gradual decompression of a system that had been operating under unsustainable pressure for so long that the absence of pressure felt initially like damage rather than relief. His breathing changed, deeper, slower. The rhythm of a body recalibrating to conditions it had not experienced in years. The physiological equivalent of a building settling onto new foundations, creaking, shifting, adjusting to distribute weight across support structures that had not previously been trusted to bear the load. Serafina watched him. She did not speak, did not offer commentary or comfort or the emotional narration that would have reduced this moment to a scene in a story rather than an event occurring in actual time. She simply watched her husband hold their living child and processed what she saw with the same analytical precision she applied to everything, but filtered now through something that analysis alone could not produce. Recognition. Not of the man she married. That man had been a political construct. The Duke, the conqueror, the strategic asset whose military authority complemented her financial intelligence. She had never loved that man. She had partnered with him, tolerated him, eventually built a parallel empire to survive him. The man holding their son was someone she had only glimpsed in fragments over 8 years, in the 11 minutes beside an empty cradle, in the tremor of hands that signed execution orders without reading the files, in the red-rimmed eyes that appeared after nights spent staring at darkness instead of sleeping. The man behind the architecture. She did not know yet whether she could love him. Love was not a decision made in nurseries during the aftermath of political crises. It was a structure built over time through accumulated evidence of trustworthiness, and the evidence so far was mixed at best, catastrophic at worst. But she could see him now, and being seen was the precondition for everything that might follow. "He needs a name," Serafina said. Cedric looked up from his son's face. "You have not named him?" "I was waiting." "For what?" "For his father to be present for the decision." The words carried weight that had nothing to do with nomenclature. Naming was claiming. Naming was commitment. Naming was the act of a parent declaring that this child existed within a family structure that intended to persist. Serafina had waited because naming the child alone would have meant accepting that the family structure consisted of only 2 people. And despite everything, the affair, the abandonment, the systematic emotional withdrawal, the 6 years of parallel empires and strategic warfare, she had not been willing to make that acceptance permanent. Not yet. "Marcus," Cedric said. Serafina studied him. "After the Mordain military tradition?" "After the first Duke of Blackthorne, who held this territory not through conquest but through alliance with the families who lived here, before my father's generation converted governance into occupation." He looked down at the infant. "Before we forgot what the name was supposed to mean." Serafina considered this for a long time. "Marcus Valicrest Mordain," she said. "Both names, both houses. The architectural statement embedded in a child's identity, that this family would not be governed by a single authority, that the Duchess's house held equal structural weight to the Duke's, that the son would carry both foundations and build on whichever proved more durable." Cedric nodded. "Marcus." The infant, newly named, continued the work of infants, breathing, sleeping, existing with the complete commitment of a creature who had not yet learned to divide attention between the present moment and the strategic management of future outcomes. His father could learn something from that commitment, had already begun learning it, would spend years learning it, because men who had spent decades constructing defenses against vulnerability did not dismantle those defenses in a single morning. They dismantled them the way they had built them, one decision at a time, one moment of presence at a time. One breath counted not from fear, but from the slowly developing habit of simply being in the room instead of managing it. Winter deepened across Blackthorne. The weeks following the Castellan delegation's departure brought the specific quality of institutional transformation that occurred when the people at the top of a power structure decided to change the structure rather than defend it. Financial audits proceeded through Mordain accounts, with the methodical thoroughness of surgeons examining a body for damage they expected to find. Military supply chains were restructured under joint Mordain-Valicrest oversight. Provincial governors accustomed to receiving orders through threat-based communication found themselves receiving directives that contained something unfamiliar. Explanation. Not just what to do. Why? the strategic reasoning behind policy decisions, the economic data supporting resource allocations, the kind of institutional transparency that Caedric's father would have considered weakness, and that Caedric himself had considered unnecessary until a Castellan's 23-year betrayal demonstrated the terminal cost of operating inside a system where information flowed only downward. The imperial court received the criminal disclosure regarding Caedric's father with the measured response of an institution accustomed to absorbing scandal without structural damage. Investigations were authorized, tribunal proceedings scheduled. The Mordain name appeared in capital newspapers beside words like reform and accountability and institutional reckoning. The coverage was not flattering. Caedric read every article, every editorial, every opinion column that dissected his family's legacy with the enthusiastic precision of writers who had spent years suspecting the Mordain mythology was fraudulent and now possessed confirmation. He read them in the nursery, not because the nursery was the most comfortable room in the castle, because it was the room where his son slept, and Caedric had discovered that reading difficult truths was more bearable in proximity to the reason he was choosing to face them. Serafina found him there one evening in late winter, sitting in the chair beside the cradle with the newspaper folded in his lap and his hand resting on the edge of Marcus's blanket. The fire burned low. Snow fell beyond the windows in the heavy, committed pattern that suggested the storm intended to last. She sat in the chair opposite. For a while, neither spoke. The silence between them was different now. Not the tactical silence of two people managing distance. Not the loaded silence of undelivered ultimatums. Something quieter and more sustainable. The silence of two people who had survived the same catastrophe and were sitting in the wreckage together, not because the wreckage was comfortable, but because neither had anywhere else to be. The tribunal ruled on Edric Voss today, Serafina said. Caedric's hand stilled on Marcus's blanket. And? Full exoneration, posthumous restoration of military rank and family honor. The Voss estate receives restitution from Mordain accounts per the terms you authorized. Caedric closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, a 19-year-old version of himself signed an execution order in black ink. The memory was not less painful now than it had been when Renard first revealed the truth, but the pain occupied a different position inside him. Not buried beneath cemented walls, not converted into architectural material for defenses designed to prevent feeling, present, located, acknowledged. The difference between pain carried and pain processed was not the absence of suffering. It was the ability to remain functional while the suffering existed, to hold both the knowledge of damage done and the commitment to prevent its repetition without allowing either to consume the other. "Have you heard from Renard?" Caedric asked. Martha's contacts report he accepted a position with the Imperial Oversight Commission, advisory role, institutional reform assessment. Serafina paused. He is apparently very good at identifying structural vulnerabilities in powerful households. Something moved across Caedric's face. Not a smile. The architecture of his features had not yet relearned how to produce that expression without strategic motivation, but something adjacent. The faint muscular shift that preceded humor in people who had spent years forgetting they were capable of it. 23 years of practice. Serafina looked at him. Will you forgive him? The question was not about Renard. Caedric understood this. The question operated on multiple levels simultaneously. The surface inquiry about the Castellan who had betrayed his household, and beneath it, the deeper question about whether a man who had spent his adult life refusing to examine his own foundations was capable of extending understanding to someone else who had operated from damage. Forgiveness requires understanding the person's reasons well enough to hold them without needing to destroy them, he said slowly. I understand why Renard did what he did. I signed his brother's death warrant. He spent 23 years dismantling my empire in response. The mathematics of that are comprehensible even if the cost was nearly terminal. He opened his eyes. What I have not yet determined is whether I can extend the same understanding to myself. The execution order, the affair, the music hall, the 6 years I spent treating you as a political asset instead of recognizing that you were the most formidable strategic mind in the empire. That will take time. I know. More time than you are comfortable with. I know that too. Serafina rose from her chair. She crossed the small distance between them and stood beside his chair, looking down at Marcus sleeping in the cradle. The infant had grown in the weeks since his birth. His features were developing definition. The jawline that would eventually carry the Mordain structure. The dark hair that already suggested Valicrest coloring. A composite. A merger. The physical embodiment of two houses that had spent years in opposition and were now attempting the more difficult work of integration. She placed her hand on Caedric's shoulder. The gesture was not dramatic. Not a declaration of reconciliation or a performance of forgiveness or the theatrical restoration of marital harmony that the Empire would have preferred as a conclusion to the scandal. It was a hand on a shoulder, physical contact between two people who had not touched each other without strategic purpose in years. Caedric did not move. He sat with his wife's hand on his shoulder and his own hand on his son's blanket, and he felt the weight of both contacts simultaneously, the downward pressure of a partnership that would require years of reconstruction and the upward pull of a small life that demanded he become someone capable of sustaining it. The balance between those weights was not comfortable. It was not supposed to be. Comfort was the condition he had sought in the music hall with Celestine, the absence of history, the relief of being admired without being known. Comfort was the drug that powerful men used to avoid the specific pain of being present in relationships that had seen them at their worst and continued existing anyway. What Seraphina's hand on his shoulder offered was not comfort, it was presence. The willingness of a woman who had seen him abandon her during childbirth, neglect her grief, ignore her intelligence, and systematically choose performance over authenticity to remain in the room with him while he learned to stop performing. Not because she had forgiven these failures. Forgiveness was a process measured in years, not moments. But because she had decided that the man capable of standing before hostile diplomats and dismantling his own mythology was someone worth remaining present for. Not the man she married. Someone she had not met yet. Someone being built from the rubble of everything that man had demolished. Outside, snow fell across Blackthorne with the patient persistence of weather systems that operated on timescales longer than human crisis. The mountains turned white. The forests bent under accumulating weight. The valley below the castle transformed slowly into a landscape that looked nothing like it had before the storm began, and would look nothing like this once spring arrived. But that was later. For now, a man sat in a nursery beside a sleeping child with his wife's hand on his shoulder and the weight of his own choices pressing against every wall he had left standing. The empire outside would continue its business of power and negotiation and the endless strategic calculation that governed the lives of people who believed control was survival. Newspapers would print their assessments. Historians would draft their narratives. Diplomats would analyze the Blackthorne crisis as a case study in institutional reform or marital politics or the predictable consequences of inherited corruption. None of them would capture this. The actual moment of change, which was not a speech or a treaty or a dramatic confrontation in a conference chamber at dawn. It was a man's hand resting on a blanket, a woman's hand resting on a shoulder, and the sound of an infant breathing in a castle that had survived its own demolition and stood now, cracked, exposed, stripped of every lie that had held it together, waiting to discover what it would become when the people inside it stopped performing strength and started building it. Snow fell. The fire burned. Marcus breathed. And for the first time in the long and violent history of Blackthorne Keep, the silence inside its walls was not the silence of things being hidden. It was the silence of things being allowed to begin.